She had everything the world said mattered: a $1 billion empire, her face on magazine covers, and a boardroom full of people who called her name with reverence. But the night a jealous executive pointed a finger at the wrong man, Serena Vale's perfect world began to crack, and what crawled out from underneath would threaten to burn everything she'd spent a decade building. This is the story of a billionaire who thought she had no more room to lose anything, and a single father who thought he had nothing left to give. Like this video, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled, and stay with us until the very end. The night everything changed, it was raining. Not the soft, cinematic kind of rain that falls in movies when something beautiful is about to happen. This was the kind of rain that soaked through your jacket before you'd made it 10 steps from your car, that turned the parking lot of the Harrington Grand Hotel into a shallow lake, and that made every guest arriving at Serena Vale's annual company gala look slightly more miserable than they'd intended. Serena stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows on the 14th floor, watching the valets below scramble under their umbrellas, and thought about how none of the people pulling up in their black SUVs and polished sedans actually wanted to be here. They came because she paid them well, because being seen at her events mattered for their careers, or because declining an invitation from Serena Vale was the kind of professional mistake people didn't make twice. Nobody came because they liked her. She wasn't sure when she'd accepted that. Maybe around 30, when the birthday cards started to feel more like professional obligations than anything else. Maybe earlier, back when she was 24 and fighting her way into her first acquisition meeting, watching the men twice her age look through her like she wasn't in the room. She'd learned quickly that being liked and being respected rarely lived in the same house, and she'd chosen respect every single time. It had cost her more than she'd expected. Ms. Vale, her assistant, Dana, appeared at her elbow with the discreet urgency she'd perfected over 3 years of working for Serena. "They're ready to seat the main table. Give me 2 minutes." Dana didn't argue. She never did. She simply stepped back and waited, which Serena had always appreciated more than she'd ever said out loud. Serena turned from the window and looked at her own reflection in the dark glass. The deep navy gown, the understated jewelry, the hair swept up in a way that her stylist had called effortless, which meant it had taken 45 minutes to achieve. She looked exactly like what the world expected her to look like. Controlled, polished, untouchable. She was 30 years old. She felt, in that moment, about twice that. Botched. Vale Restoration Group occupied a specific and unusual corner of the American business landscape. In an era when most companies were chasing digital platforms and software margins, Serena had built something that worked with its hands, a restoration empire that specialized in bringing damaged, neglected, or historically significant structures back to life. It had started with her grandfather's small renovation company, which her father had nearly run into the ground through a combination of poor management and worse judgment. Serena had stepped in at 22, fresh out of a construction management degree, with nothing but a stubborn refusal to watch the family name disappear. Within 4 years, she'd restructured the debt, landed 3 major municipal contracts, and rebranded the company entirely. Now, 8 years later, Vale Restoration operated in 11 states, employed over 3,000 people, and had recently been valued at just under $2 billion. They'd restored government buildings, protected historic neighborhoods, salvaged industrial complexes that cities had given up on. Architectural Digest had called them the conscience of modern construction. Forbes had put Serena on their 30 under 30 list 2 years running before she'd aged out of eligibility. Her face was recognizable in business circles in a way that still occasionally surprised her. She'd never sought celebrity. She'd sought results. But celebrity had come anyway, trailing behind success like an unwanted shadow. The gala tonight was the annual company event she hosted every November, a formal dinner for top clients, key partners, and senior staff that served the dual purpose of celebrating the year's work and maintaining the relationships that kept the company healthy. Serena had attended as the founder for 6 consecutive years now and had never once enjoyed it. She went anyway, because that was what you did. Logan Mercer arrived 12 minutes late. He'd known he would be late from the moment he'd gotten Chloe settled at his mother's place and discovered that the only dress shirt he owned that still fit properly had a button missing from the cuff. He'd found a safety pin in the junk drawer, done his best, and driven through the rain with one eye on the road and one eye on his sleeve, hoping nobody would notice. It was that kind of night. He handed his jacket to the coat check attendant and stood at the entrance to the ballroom for a moment, taking in the scale of the thing. He'd seen photos of these events in the company newsletter, but seeing it in person was different. The room probably held 300 people, all of them looking expensive and at ease in a way that Logan had never quite mastered, even on his best days. Crystal glassware caught the light from the overhead chandeliers. Servers moved through the crowd with practiced invisibility. Someone near the far wall was playing a violin, though the sound barely carried over the conversation. Logan found his assigned table near the middle of the room, nodded to the two colleagues already seated there, a project coordinator named Marcus and an older engineer named Phil, who Logan had worked with on a courthouse restoration in Baltimore, and settled into his chair. "You're late," Marcus said. "I know." "Chloe giving you trouble?" "Chloe's fine. She was helping my mom bake something when I left. Looked happier about that than she ever looks about anything I cook." Logan reached for the water glass. "Lost a button." Marcus glanced at his cuff. "Safety pin?" "Don't look at it directly." Marcus laughed. Phil, who was 63 and had spent 30 years in the field before moving to senior supervision, looked at Logan with the particular expression of a man who had survived several decades of these events and had made a kind of peace with them. 3 hours, Phil said. "That's all it is? After 3 hours, you can leave without anyone saying anything." "Reassuring. I've been timing it for 6 years. 3 hours is the window." Logan looked around the room again, not looking for anything specific, just orienting himself the way he always did in unfamiliar environments. He noticed the executive table at the front of the room, a longer table set slightly apart from the others, with better linens and more elaborate floral arrangements. The seat at the center was empty. He noticed because he noticed things. It was occupational. Craftsmen who didn't pay attention to their surroundings had short careers and sometimes worse outcomes than that. He'd started at Vale Restoration 14 months ago, after 8 years with a smaller firm in Virginia that had folded when its founder retired, and the buyout fell through. The loss had been inconvenient in the way that losing a job was always inconvenient. Bills didn't care about your circumstances, and Chloe was 7 and needed consistent things around her, a school she knew, a routine that held. Logan had found the position at Vale through a former colleague, had driven up to the Philadelphia regional office for his interview, and had gotten the job on the strength of his portfolio, which included some genuinely difficult projects that most craftsmen wouldn't have touched. He'd been good at it his whole adult life. Not brilliant in the way that some people were brilliant, the ones who could look at a structure and immediately understand it in 3 dimensions, who had the kind of natural spatial intelligence that made them seem almost psychic. Logan was not that. What he was precise, patient, willing to spend 3 hours getting a single joint right when the less careful version would have taken 45 minutes and been fined for 20 years before showing any problems. The foreman on his first Vale project had noticed within 2 weeks. By month 3, Logan was leading his first crew. By month 8, he was being consulted on projects he wasn't even assigned to because the project managers had figured out that his assessments were reliable in a way that saved money and headaches down the road. He didn't think about it in those terms. He just did the work the way the work needed to be done. What he tried not to think about were the things that working long hours and focusing on the craft helped him avoid thinking about, the absence that was always at the edge of everything, the way Chloe sometimes looked at other kids' mothers at school pickup and didn't say anything, just looked. Her name had been Maya, and she'd been 31 when the accident happened on I-95 4 years ago now, and Logan had learned that grief didn't go away so much as it changed shape, became less sharp and more like something permanently woven into the fabric of ordinary days, noticeable but no longer fatal. He was fine. He told people that and mostly meant it. Chloe was fine, mostly, in the way that 8-year-olds were resilient and adaptable and also deeply perceptive about the things adults pretended weren't there. They were fine. They managed. They were not. And Logan had made his peace with this years ago, anything close to what they'd once been when all 3 of them were whole. Serena took her seat at the executive table 40 minutes into the evening, after finishing the obligatory rounds of handshakes and small talk near the entrance that these events required of her. She'd spoken to 3 major clients, 2 board members, and a city councilman who seemed to be under the impression that they were closer friends than they actually were. She'd smiled the right number of times, said the right things, and managed to remember the names of two spouses she'd met only once before, which she considered a minor victory. Richard Colton was already seated at the executive table when she arrived. She noticed him the way she always noticed Richard Colton, with a low, steady alertness that she'd learned not to ignore. He was the VP of operations, had been with the company for 6 years, and was the kind of competent that looked like more than it was if you didn't read the numbers carefully. He was also, and had been for the past year, increasingly agitated about the direction of the company's project allocation, though he was careful about where and how he showed it. Serena had her reasons for watching him. She hadn't yet decided what to do with those reasons. Richard smiled when she sat down. It was a practiced smile, polished and professional, with nothing behind it. "Serena, wonderful turnout tonight." "It usually is." She unfolded her napkin. "Good year. People want to celebrate." "Absolutely." He lifted his wine glass in a half gesture. "And a strong finish ahead on the Henderson project. That's largely Mercer's work, from what I understand." Serena kept her expression neutral. "The Henderson project is on track. It's a strong team." "Mercer specifically, though." There was something in how Richard said it. Not aggressive, just deliberate, like he was testing the temperature of the water. "You've taken a particular interest in his work. I've noticed you've pulled his assessment reports directly a few times in the past month." "I pull assessment reports from multiple project leads." "Of course." He set the glass down. "Of course you do." She didn't take the bait. She rarely did. But she filed the moment away, as she filed away most things Richard Colton said or did, because men who spoke like that were usually preparing to say something worse. She saw Logan Mercer for the first time that evening about an hour into dinner. Not to speak to, she hadn't spoken to him yet, had only reviewed his work, had his name flagged on a half-dozen files that had crossed her desk in the past months, with the consistent note of exceptional quality ahead of schedule. She knew what he looked like from the company directory, the kind of standard headshot that made everyone look slightly uncomfortable and vaguely suspicious. He was at a middle table near the edge of the room, talking to the older engineer she recognized as Phil Garrett, who'd been with the company longer than almost anyone. Logan was listening more than he was talking, which she noticed because most people at these events did the opposite. He laughed once at something Phil said, not the polite social laugh she'd heard all evening, but the real kind, a little too loud, quickly corralled. He was also, she noticed, fiddling with his cuff. She almost smiled, which surprised her. She was not typically a person who almost smiled at strangers fiddling with their cuffs. She turned back to her table, and the evening continued. The incident happened near the end of the night, when the formal dinner had dissolved into the loosely structured cocktail portion that Serena always considered the most dangerous part of any corporate event, the point at which the wine had been flowing for 2 hours, and people's internal governors started to loosen. She'd stepped away from the executive table to speak with a structural engineer from the Denver office when she heard the tone shift. Not shouting, nothing so obvious. A raised voice at a certain pitch, the kind that carries through crowd noise in a specific way that made other conversations pause around it. She turned toward the sound. Richard Colton was standing near the far edge of the room, and he was talking to Logan Mercer. She moved closer, staying at the edge of the gathering cluster without making herself visible. Special treatment from the beginning. Richard's voice had the clipped, overly controlled quality of a man who was angry but aware that he was at a company event. The Henderson file alone. You were brought in 6 weeks ahead of schedule, above your grade level, without the standard review process. You want to tell me how that happened? Logan had his hands at his sides. His posture was very still, the way some people went still when they were working hard not to react. The site foreman requested me specifically based on a previous project. That's in the record. The site foreman. Richard's mouth curved slightly. Right. Not anything else. I'm not sure what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. But his tone said otherwise, clearly and deliberately. I'm just observing that certain people move through this company faster than others, and wondering out loud what accounts for the difference. There were maybe 15 people close enough to hear this exchange clearly, and Serena could see the way it was landing. The uncomfortable glances, the careful way people were positioning themselves, the quiet social calculation of whether to say something or stay out of it. She made her decision before she was fully aware of having made it. "Richard." Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the ambient noise with the particular authority of someone who owned the room they were standing in the most literal sense. Richard turned. Something moved behind his eyes. Surprise, then recalibration, then the professional composure he'd spent years cultivating. "Serena, I heard." She stepped fully into the space, not aggressive, just present. The Henderson project assignment was reviewed and approved through standard procurement channels. The documentation exists and is available to anyone who wants to look at it. She paused just long enough. "If you have a formal concern about a personnel decision, there's a process for that." Richard's jaw tightened. "Of course. I wasn't suggesting—" "Good." She looked at him for another half second, long enough to make the point clearly, then turned to the rest of the gathered cluster with the smooth social pivot she'd spent years perfecting. "We should be moving toward the dessert portion. There's a creme brulee situation that I've been promised is worth the wait." A few people laughed, more people exhaled, and the moment dispersed. She walked toward the dessert tables without looking back. Logan Mercer, she noticed peripherally, was watching her. Not in the way people usually watched her, calculating or performative or deferential. More like someone who wasn't sure what to make of something that had just happened. She understood the feeling. None. Dana found her near the windows again an hour later with the particular expression that meant news. "The video is circulating," Dana said, without preamble. She held up her phone. Someone had caught the exchange on their phone camera, the roughly 90-second clip starting from Richard's raised voice and ending with Serena's exit. The caption, from an account Serena didn't recognize, read simply, "Billionaire CEO, publicly defends employee at company Gala." But why? It had 3,000 shares already. Serena had been watching it go. She knew what this was. "It'll be on 3 business outlets by morning," Serena said. "It's already on 2. She looked at the video. The framing was unflattering. Phones at events never had good angles. But the audio was clear enough, and the moment read in a specific way when you watched it removed from context. She could see how it would be interpreted. She was already interpreting it herself, through the lens of someone who had been in front of cameras and headlines long enough to know how these things moved. A public CEO visibly invested in a specific employee's reputation, at a company event, after hours. The story would write itself, and it wouldn't be accurate, and it wouldn't need to be. "Get me the full performance record on Logan Mercer," she said. "Everything, and find out who shot this video." Dana was already typing. "The board is going to have questions." "The board is going to have a lot of questions." Serena looked at the window, at her own reflection again. "Start with the Henderson documentation. I want everything documented and accessible before 7 a.m. "On it." Serena looked at the video one more time. In the footage, you could see Logan Mercer in the background, watching her walk away. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his posture, a kind of careful stillness, that she found herself thinking about more than she wanted to. She put her phone away. It was not, she told herself firmly, her concern. The concern was the media, the board, and the narrative. The concern was the company. The concern was not the craftsman with the safety pin in his cuff, who had stood very still and not flinched. The next morning arrived ugly. Serena was awake at 5, which was not unusual. She sat at the kitchen table of her Philadelphia penthouse apartment with coffee and her laptop, scrolling through the damage assessment. By 6 a.m., the clip had accumulated 40,000 shares. By 6:30, she had received 4 text messages from board members, 2 from investors, and 1 from her personal attorney, who only reached out on weekends when something was actually on fire. The headline that bothered her most was from a financial newsletter she'd respected before this moment. Vail Restoration, CEO's personal investment in employee raises governance concerns. Governance. That was the word that actually landed. She'd spent 8 years building a company with a governance record that she was genuinely proud of. A company where people at every level understood that advancement was based on work and nothing else, because she'd enforced that principle personally and publicly from the beginning. One viral video, 90 seconds of her doing the right thing for the wrong-looking reason, and the word governance was being used in the same sentence as her name. She put the coffee down harder than she meant to. Her phone rang. Marcus Webb, chairman of the board. She answered on the second ring. Marcus? Tell me you've seen it. I've seen all of it. The Hendricks Group is calling an emergency review of the partnership agreement. They want assurances before they sign on Friday. Marcus's voice was measured, which was how he handled things when he was genuinely concerned. When he wasn't concerned, he was expansive. He was not being expansive. Serena, I need to understand what happened. I defended an employee from an unfair accusation at a company event. That's what happened. The optics, I know what the optics look like. She stood and walked to the window. The city below was beginning to move in the early morning light, the streets still wet from last night's rain. I'm going to step back from the Henderson Project review and have it transferred to the Oversight Committee. Full documentation will be available to anyone who requests it. A pause on the line. That's a significant step. It's the right step. If there's any possibility that my involvement creates the appearance of bias, I remove myself. That's how this works. Some people will see that as an admission. Some people will see it as evidence that I take governance seriously. She kept her voice flat, professional. Which is what I'd like them to see because it's true. Another pause, longer this time. All right, we'll schedule the emergency board call for Monday morning. In the meantime, I'll be dealing with it. She ended the call and stood at the window for a long moment, holding the phone against her side. The worst part wasn't the headlines. The worst part was the particular hollow feeling of having done something completely straightforward and watching it be turned into something complicated by the simple mechanics of how power and perception worked. She'd defended a man who was being treated unfairly, and now that man's career, which had been the thing she was trying to protect, was exactly as complicated as it would have been if she'd stayed silent. Maybe more so. Logan heard about this coverage at 7 a.m. when Marcus from his team sent him a link with the message. Bro, you need to see this. He sat in his car outside his mother's house, where Chloe was still sleeping, and read through 3 articles in the time it took the coffee in his travel mug to go from hot to lukewarm. He watched the video twice. He read the comment sections, which he knew he shouldn't have and did anyway, which was a mistake. The comments fell into 2 camps. The first camp was generous, people defending Serena Vale, pointing out that defending an employee from a baseless accusation was exactly what a CEO should do, noting that the story had been twisted by people looking for drama. The second camp was less generous, and it was louder, and it included a specific range of assumptions about Logan's role in whatever narrative they decided was happening that made him feel faintly sick. He was 32 years old and had never been mentioned in any publication at any level. And now his name was in 3 different business outlets and 1 tabloid entertainment site under headlines that he found himself unable to finish reading. He called his mother's landline. Have you seen? Yes, his mother said immediately. Linda from next door showed me this morning. Mom, she meant well. Mom, I need you to keep Chloe away from the internet today. A pause. Logan, she's 8. She doesn't read business news. I know, He stopped, rubbed his face. I need to figure out what to do. What you're going to do, his mother said, with the patient, inexhaustible certainty she'd had his whole life, is go to work, do your job, and not do anything dramatic. You didn't do anything wrong. I know I didn't do anything wrong. Then act like it. He drove to the regional office, kept his head down, did the morning site checks, answered exactly 3 questions from colleagues with some version of I don't know more than you do, and spent the afternoon reviewing the Henderson structural reports with focused, grinding attention to detail that kept his thoughts from moving where he didn't want them to go. At 4:30, he got an email from HR informing him that the Henderson Oversight Committee would be taking over the project review, per executive directive, and that his role would remain unchanged, but the evaluation process would follow a different chain of approval going forward. He read it twice. He understood what it meant. She was protecting the company by removing any official connection between them. He understood it. He didn't have to like it. He closed the email, went back to the structural reports, and spent the next hour staring at load calculations without actually processing a single number. What Logan didn't know, what nobody except 3 people in the entire company knew, was that the video had been shot deliberately. Dana figured it out 4 days later by tracing the social media account that had posted the original clip back through 3 degrees of digital separation to a personal contact of Richard Colton's. A personal contact who had been at the gala as a +1, who had positioned himself specifically near that end of the room, and who had started recording before Richard had raised his voice loudly enough to constitute an incident. It had been orchestrated, not improvised. Dana brought this to Serena on a Tuesday morning with a printed dossier and the careful expression she wore when delivering information she suspected would change things. Serena read through it twice, set it down, and sat with it for a full 60 seconds without speaking. Richard Colton had been at the company for 6 years. He was VP of Operations. He had full access to project files, vendor relationships, financial reporting, and personnel decisions at almost every level below the executive committee. She thought about the Hendricks contract review delay. She thought about 3 anomalous cost overruns on projects in the Western region over the past year, each of which had been attributed to supply chain issues, and each of which she had accepted that attribution on because supply chain issues were genuinely endemic to the industry and she'd had no reason to look deeper. She thought about a bid on a federal restoration contract in Pittsburgh that they'd lost by a margin that had surprised her at the time, given the strength of their proposal. She thought about 6 years of Richard Colton's practiced professional smile. "Get me the full financial records for the past 18 months, she said, operations specifically, and don't go through the standard channels. Use the external auditors." Dana wrote it down. Timeline? Fast. Logan found out about the deeper investigation 3 weeks later, not from any official source, but from Marcus, who had an informal relationship with 2 people on the audit team and who had pieced together enough to understand the rough shape of what was happening. He found Logan at the Henderson site on a Thursday afternoon, pulled him aside with the particular urgency of a man who'd been sitting on information longer than was comfortable, and told him what he knew. "Colton's been running something," Marcus said. They were outside, standing near the site fence while rain threatened overhead, the same gray November sky that had been present for most of the past month. The auditors found discrepancies in 3 project budgets. Maybe more. And the Hendricks contract? The delay wasn't market conditions, or not just market conditions. Someone fed inaccurate cost projections to the Hendricks team before the deadline. Logan looked at him. Someone. The kind of someone who had access to that information. "Why are you telling me this?" Marcus shrugged, but his eyes were serious. "Because you got dragged into this when you didn't ask to be. And because..." He stopped. "She's been in her office every night this week until past midnight. Alone. The board is in crisis mode, and she's holding the whole thing together by herself, same as she always does. And I don't know why exactly, but I thought you should know." Logan looked at the site fence for a moment. The heavy cable he'd been assessing before Marcus appeared hung against the steel frame, and he looked at it without really seeing it. "Thanks," he said. "Don't do anything stupid," Marcus said immediately. "I wasn't planning to." "You have your thinking face on." "I think a lot." "Right." Marcus started to walk away, then turned back. "Logan, she's good at this. She doesn't need rescuing." "I know that. Just making sure." He drove past the Vale Restoration Regional Headquarters on his way home that night. He didn't stop. There was nothing to stop for, no reason to be there, no logic that held. He drove past slowly, looked up at the 3rd floor where the executive offices were, and saw a single light still burning in the corner office at 9:15 p.m. He drove home. He picked up Chloe from his mother's, listened to her talk about a project she was doing about ocean creatures. She'd decided octopuses were the most interesting thing in the world this month, which had lasted longer than the dinosaur phase, but Logan suspected would eventually yield to something new, and sat on the edge of her bed after she'd fallen asleep, just being in the quiet of the room for a few minutes. He thought about a woman alone in a lit office at 9:15, holding a company together with both hands while the thing she'd built from nothing was being deliberately picked apart by someone she'd trusted. He thought about what Marcus had said. She doesn't need rescuing. He knew that. He'd known that the first night, watching her walk away from the incident at the gala with the particular self-possession of someone who had learned very young not to show what it cost her. He'd recognized something in that quality, though he couldn't have named it cleanly, the specific texture of someone who managed hard things alone because they'd had to, and had gotten so practiced at it that they'd stopped checking whether it was still necessary. He wasn't going to do anything stupid. He was going to go to work, do his job, and stay in his lane. He turned off Chloe's light and went to bed. He didn't sleep well, which was a different problem entirely, and one he chose not to examine too closely. On the 5th day of the 4th week after the gala, the Henderson site had a problem. It was the kind of problem that happened on active restoration projects. Not catastrophic, not a failure of planning, just the kind of complication that appeared when you opened a wall you hadn't opened in 60 years and found conditions that no assessment had predicted. In this case, a load-bearing wall on the northeast corner of the 3rd floor had deteriorated to a point that required immediate shoring before any further work could proceed, and the crew chief had called it at 3 in the afternoon with a flag that went directly to Logan as lead assessor. Logan was on site within 20 minutes. He pulled on his hard hat, moved through the scaffolding to the affected section, and spent the next 90 minutes doing the kind of close-in assessment that required the full range of what he knew: his hands, his eyes, the accumulated knowledge of a decade of working in spaces where the consequences of getting it wrong were permanent. The shoring could be done. It would add 4 days and cost money, but the work was solid and the building would be fine. He was writing up the assessment when his phone rang. An unknown number. He let it go to voicemail. 5 minutes later, listening to it, he understood that the evening was about to become something different entirely. It was Serena Vale's voice. She'd clearly been in the middle of saying something when the voicemail began. "If you can, Logan, and I know this is completely outside of..." And then the call had cut out, the rest of it lost, leaving only background noise that he identified automatically from the sound of it as a construction site or a building under construction. The kind of ambient noise he'd spent enough time around to know the signature, echo from concrete walls, the particular quality of sound in unfinished space. Not her office, not any finished space. He called back immediately. The phone rang 12 times. No answer. He sat very still for a moment, thinking. It was possible this meant nothing. Her phone died. She'd pocket dialed. There were 100 ordinary explanations. He pulled up his contacts, found Marcus. "Where's Serena right now?" Marcus, who was apparently eating dinner, said, "What?" "Right now. Where is she?" Logan, I don't know. Her office, probably, or..." "Why?" "She called me, left half a message, and then cut out. The background sounded like an unfinished construction site." A pause on the line. "That doesn't... She wouldn't be at an active site at... She's not returning calls." Logan. "Is there anything in her calendar? Any site she'd have reason to visit tonight?" He heard Marcus moving, keyboard sounds. The brisk efficiency of someone who'd suddenly shifted into a different mode entirely. "There's a note in tomorrow's executive calendar, preliminary walkthrough at the Dalton commercial site, which is... It's on Morrison. The renovation project we're 6 months from completing. It's not fully secure yet. The interior... Address," and Marcus gave it. Logan was already moving. The rain started again on the way. He drove through it faster than was prudent, the road signs strobing past in the wet, the wipers barely keeping pace with the downpour that had come out of nowhere the way November storms in this part of the country sometimes did. He was running possibilities in his head, the same way he ran structural assessments. Not to scare himself, just to understand what he might be driving toward, what the actual situation was. The Dalton site was 6 months from completion. That meant it was in the stage where the structural bones were solid, but the interior was gutted, the electrical wasn't fully functional, egress routes weren't fully secured, and fire suppression wasn't yet operational. It was also the stage where a building was most vulnerable to certain kinds of damage. He pushed that thought to the side and focused on the road. The site was dark when he pulled up, which told him nothing. Sites were dark at night. That was normal. But there was a car in the adjacent lot that he identified as a company vehicle, the kind that the senior executive team used for site visits. He checked it as he moved past. Serena Vale, on the registration sticker inside the windshield. He called her phone one more time as he approached the site entrance. Straight to voicemail now, which meant either dead battery or the phone itself was gone. The main site entrance was secured, padlocked the way it should be. He found the secondary entrance around the east side, which was the kind of thing you only found if you knew how sites like this were typically configured, and discovered that the padlock had been opened and left hanging. He went in. The inside of the Dalton building was the particular darkness of unfinished construction at night, not total black because ambient city light came through the unglazed window openings on the upper floors, casting enough diffuse glow to navigate by if you knew how to read the shadows. Logan had spent enough time in spaces like this to know how to move through them. He found the stairwell, went up to the second floor and stopped. Smoke. Not heavy, not the rolling black kind that meant active fire, but the thin, acrid kind that meant something burning that wasn't supposed to be burning, somewhere close by. His body cataloged it automatically before his brain fully caught up. Source likely east section, upper floor, papers or accelerant, recent start. He took the stairs up to the third floor and went toward the east. He found her in what would eventually be a conference room, currently a raw concrete space with exposed framing and a single window opening looking out over the city. Serena was pressed against the far wall, her jacket was gone, and she was using it to cover a section of exposed framing where a small fire was working slowly through a pile of paper and construction debris. Someone had lit it deliberately. He could see that immediately. The placement was too considered, too central. The papers not randomly scattered but arranged. She was beating it down and mostly winning, but the smoke was building in the confined space, and she was starting to cough. "Hey," he said. She spun around. For a half-second, her face showed something raw and unprepared, fear, then relief, then the composure reasserting itself almost instantly, which might have been the most honest thing he'd ever seen anyone do. "Logan." Her voice was rough from the smoke. "Get away from it. Get to the window." "I've almost got it." "The smoke is worse than the fire right now and you're breathing it. Get to the window. I'll get the fire." She looked at him for a moment, then moved to the window. He used her jacket and the drop cloth he found draped over a nearby stack of materials to smother the fire, working efficiently in the way he worked at everything, watching it surrender. It took 4 minutes. When it was done, he looked at the pile, identified the papers, the arrangement, the corner of something he'd need to not disturb before investigators could get here. He crossed to the window where Serena was standing in the night air, breathing carefully, and stood next to her. The city spread out below them in the rain, lights smeared and moving. "Where is he?" Logan asked. She looked at him. "How do you know it was he? Where is he?" "He left." Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't quite. "He locked the door after he started it. I got it open. The lock was cheap, one of the site temporaries, but by then he was already gone." "Did he take anything?" "Files. The original physical copies of the Henderson financial records that I brought to show him." She stopped. "I came here to meet him because he said he had information about the auditors, about someone else in the company who was responsible. I thought—" She stopped again, and something crossed her face that she clearly didn't like showing. "I thought I was thinking clearly. You were trying to protect the company. I was careless." She said it flatly, without self-pity, just the direct accounting of someone tallying up a mistake. "That's not the same thing." Logan looked at the city below. The rain was letting up slightly, or maybe just shifting direction. He thought about a lot of things in the silence that followed and chose not to say most of them. "Colton?" he asked instead. "Yes." "Okay." He pulled out his phone. "I'm calling the police and then I'm calling your attorney. Do you have your attorney's number in your phone?" "I have it memorized." "Of course you do." He dialed. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Your hands are shaking." A pause. "I'm aware of that." "That's okay," he said. It was a simple thing to say, probably too simple, but he said it anyway because it seemed like the kind of thing she might not have heard recently. Then he turned slightly away to give her something like privacy while the call connected and waited in the dark building for the city to come to them. Outside the window, the rain continued, steady and indifferent and entirely unconcerned with the wreckage it was falling on. Some things, Logan had learned, didn't wait for good weather. The police arrived in 2 units, followed 11 minutes later by a fire investigator who walked the 3rd floor with a flashlight and confirmed what Logan had already assessed from the arrangement of the debris. Deliberate ignition, accelerant assisted, designed to spread slowly enough to give someone time to leave the building before it became serious. Not an attempt to kill, or at least not a competent one. An attempt to destroy specific documents and create chaos. The detective who took Serena's statement was a woman named Reyes, mid-40s, with the particular patience of someone who had interviewed a lot of people in shock and knew how to wait for the information underneath the adrenaline. She let Serena talk through it twice without interrupting, then asked her questions in a sequence that Logan recognized as methodical even from where he stood across the room, giving them space. He'd given his own statement to the second officer, how he'd gotten the call, what he'd heard in the voicemail, why he'd come to the site, what he'd found. The officer had written it down and asked him twice whether he was certain about the arrangement of the papers, and Logan had said yes both times, and the officer had written that down too. At some point, Serena's attorney arrived. Logan didn't know his name, only that he was in his 50s, appeared to have dressed very quickly, and immediately took control of the conversation with the police in the practiced way of someone who had been managing crises for other people for a long time. Serena stepped back when he arrived and let him work, which was probably the right call, and Logan watched her do it, and watched the way she crossed her arms and looked at the far wall and breathed carefully while the attorney and Detective Reyes sorted through the procedural elements. She was still holding it together. He didn't know if that was resilience or habit at this point, and he suspected she didn't either. Around midnight, Detective Reyes told them they could leave and that someone would be in contact in the morning. The attorney walked Serena to the site entrance, talking in a low voice the whole time. Logan followed at a distance that felt appropriate. Not too close, not absent. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. The air had that washed quality it got after a long storm, sharp and cold and clean in a way that felt almost aggressive after the smoke inside. Serena stood on the pavement near the building entrance while her attorney finished his summary, and Logan stood near the company car and waited. The attorney shook Serena's hand, said something Logan couldn't hear, and left. She stood there for a moment after he was gone, not moving, just standing in the stopped rain. Then she turned and looked at Logan across the 20 feet of empty pavement between them. "You should go home," she said. "It's late." "Probably." "Your daughter?" "She's at my mother's. She's fine." Serena looked at him for a moment. Something was moving behind her eyes that she was working on keeping off her face, and she wasn't entirely succeeding, which he thought was probably the most human he'd ever seen her look. "Thank you," she said, "for coming. You called me." "Half a voicemail." It was enough. She looked away, at the street, at nothing specific. "You shouldn't be involved in this. You were already the coverage from the gala, and now if it comes out that you were here tonight..." "I was already here. That's done." He put his hands in his jacket pockets against the cold. "The question now is what happens next. The question now is a police investigation and an emergency board meeting and probably the worst week of my professional life." She said it without drama, just the flat accounting of facts. "I know how to handle those things." I know you do." She looked back at him. "You don't know me." "No," he agreed, "but I've read your work, 14 months of it. And tonight?" He paused. "You stayed in a burning room to beat down a fire instead of just leaving because you were trying to preserve evidence. That was stubborn, yes, also competent." He wasn't trying to flatter her. He was just saying what was accurate. You knew what you were looking at and you acted on it. Most people would have run. She was quiet for a moment. The street was empty in the aftermath of the storm, the lights reflecting off wet pavement in long, distorted lines. "Go home, Logan," she said finally. It wasn't dismissive. It was something closer to careful. He went home. Richard Colton was gone by morning. Not gone in the clean, formal sense of a resignation, gone in the sense that he'd cleared his office sometime between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m., removed his personal effects, and left a letter of resignation on the desk of the HR director that was 2 paragraphs long and said, essentially, nothing. His company access cards had already been deactivated by the time security arrived for the morning shift, which meant he'd anticipated that someone would move quickly, which meant he'd had a plan for this. Serena read the resignation letter at 6:15 a.m., sitting in her actual office this time, with coffee she'd barely touched, and the particular feeling of someone who had slept 3 hours and was running on the specific fuel of controlled anger and the knowledge that stopping now was not an option. Marcus Webb, the board chairman, arrived at 7. He didn't knock, which was his way of indicating that this was beyond the usual professional courtesies. He sat across from her desk, looked at the resignation letter she slid across to him, and read it twice. "He knew we were closing in," Marcus said. "He's been careful the whole time." She pulled up the preliminary audit report on her laptop and turned the screen toward him. 3 project budgets, vendor invoices that don't match delivery records. The Hendricks cost projections were sent from a company email account that traced back to a temporary login. He created it 6 months ago, used it twice, deleted it, but the server logs kept it. The auditors found it in 48 hours. This is... Marcus scrolled through the report. The Pittsburgh bid. He fed inaccurate materials cost projections to our estimating team before the submission deadline. We underbid by 11% on labor and overbid by 8% on materials, which made us look like we didn't understand our own numbers. The review committee noted it specifically in their rejection letter. She'd read that rejection letter 3 times over the past year, trying to understand what had gone wrong. I thought it was an internal error. I had 3 conversations with the estimating team about process improvement. Those people must have felt they did what I asked and got criticized for someone else's sabotage. That's the part. She stopped. There was a particular quality of anger that she'd learned to manage over the years, the kind that came from watching people she was responsible for absorb damage that wasn't aimed at them. She put it back in the box where it lived and breathed through it. We'll deal with that. That's one of the things we'll deal with. Marcus set down the laptop. He was 61 years old, had been on the board for 4 years, and was one of the handful of people in Serena's professional life that she considered genuinely trustworthy in the full sense of the word. He looked at her now with an expression that was professional and something else, the something else being the kind of honest concern that didn't dress itself up in business language. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Not as a formality. I'm functional." "That's not what I asked." She held his gaze for a moment. "I will be, when this is resolved. It may take a while to resolve." "I know." She reached for the coffee, drank some of it even though it had gone past the point of being good. "The Hendricks Group. I need you to call them this morning, before 10, before they hear it from someone else. Give them the full picture. If they want to delay signing pending the outcome of the investigation, I'll accept that. And if they want out entirely, then we'll lose the contract." She said it the way you said a thing that hurt, but that you'd already decided you could survive. "That's not the worst outcome here." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I don't suppose it is." The board meeting was scheduled for Monday. By Friday, the preliminary audit findings had been formally submitted to the company's legal team. A copy had gone to Detective Reyes, and 3 additional project irregularities had been identified that bumped the total estimated damage to the company's finances above $2 million. That number landed differently than Serena had expected it to. Not because it was devastating, it wasn't in the scale of the company's operations, but because of what it represented, the accumulation of small, deliberate destructions, each one individually explainable, collectively a sustained campaign of sabotage by someone who had sat in her meetings and eaten at her gala table and looked her in the eye for 6 years. She found herself replaying specific conversations with Richard in the past year, moments where he'd pushed back on project allocations, asked questions that had seemed like legitimate scrutiny, offered information that she'd accepted at face value. She went through each one like an auditor herself, recategorizing them, understanding the shape of what they'd actually been. It was a particular kind of exhausting, learning to see the past differently. She worked late every night that week, not because there was always more to do, though there usually was, but because the apartment felt very empty in the particular way it had started feeling empty about 2 years ago, when she'd understood that the social life she'd maintained through her 20s, the occasional relationships, the dinners with friends from college who were now scattered across 3 time zones, had gradually contracted to almost nothing, casualties of the amount of time and attention the company consumed. She told herself it was temporary. Most things she told herself were temporary. On Thursday evening, she was still in the office at 8:30, working through vendor contract reviews when she heard a knock on the open door. Logan Mercer was standing in the doorway. She looked at him for a moment without speaking, mostly because she hadn't expected it and needed a second to recalibrate. He was in his work clothes, jacket over one arm, clearly coming from a site visit rather than anything planned. He looked tired in a way that the workday accounted for, and slightly uncertain, which she thought was probably the most honest expression she'd seen on anyone in days. "Dana said you were here," he said. "She was leaving when I came up. I probably should have called." "Probably." She set down her pen. "Is something wrong with the Henderson site?" "No. Henderson is fine." He didn't move from the doorway. "I wanted to know if you were okay." She looked at him steadily. "You keep asking me that." "You keep not quite answering it." She almost said something deflecting. She had several versions available, practiced and ready, but stopped. It was late, and she was tired, and something about the bluntness of him standing there in the doorway, in his work jacket, asking a simple question with no agenda behind it, made the usual deflections feel more effort than they were worth. "Come in," she said. He came in, sat in one of the chairs across from her desk, and put his jacket over the back of it. He looked around the office briefly, the way he always seemed to assess spaces he entered, a professional reflex she'd noticed, and then looked back at her. "The audit findings," she said. $2 million in damages, roughly. 3 project failures that I now understand weren't failures. The Pittsburgh bid." She watched his face. "You knew about Pittsburgh?" "Marcus told me some of it. We lost that contract and I spent 4 months reviewing our estimating process." She heard the flatness in her own voice. 4 months. 3 people went through individual performance reviews because I thought they'd made systematic errors. They hadn't made systematic errors. They'd been set up, and I was the one who... She stopped. "You didn't know," Logan said. "I should have looked harder." "Maybe. But you trusted your people, and he exploited that. That's on him. It happened in my company." "Yeah." He didn't try to argue that away. It did. She appreciated that, the not arguing it away. Most people, when they were trying to make her feel better, reached for the exonerating version of events. Logan seemed to understand that she wasn't looking for exoneration, just someone to sit in the truth of it with her for a minute. "The board meeting is Monday," she said. "I know. There are 2 members who are going to use this as leverage for decisions they've wanted to push through for 2 years. Restructuring the executive committee. Bringing in outside management for operations." She was thinking out loud more than explaining, which she almost never did. "They're not wrong to raise it. I have a leadership gap at the VP level that needs to be filled thoughtfully, and a company that just discovered it was being sabotaged from the inside, and the honest answer to how did this happen is that I was too close to the operational day-to-day to see the pattern in the numbers until the auditors looked at it fresh." "What are you going to do?" "Agree with them on the parts they're right about." She reached for the coffee again, remembered it was cold, set it back down, and push back on the parts where they're wrong, which is the assumption that the core problem is structural rather than one specific person who is now gone. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city did its nighttime thing, distant traffic, the hum of the building's HVAC, the occasional siren that lived somewhere in the background of every city night. "For what it's worth," he said, "the people in the field, the crews, the project leads, they know what the company is. They knew before this, and they still know now. Whatever happens in that boardroom Monday." He said it matter-of-factly, not trying to comfort her exactly, just reporting something he'd observed. "People doing the work know who's actually running it." She looked at him. "That's a generous thing to say." "It's an accurate thing to say." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. There was something genuinely disarming about him, and she'd been noticing it for weeks without wanting to examine it too closely. The way he occupied a room without trying to fill it, the directness that had nothing performative in it, the fact that he was one of the very few people she'd spoken to in recent memory who said what he meant without first calculating how it would land. "You should go home," she said. "You have a daughter." "She's with my mother tonight." Study group tomorrow. Early drop-off. He stood, picked up his jacket. I just wanted to check in. You walked into the CEO's office at 8:30 at night to check in. He looked at her with a slight expression that was somewhere between rueful and direct. I did. That's... She stopped. She'd been about to say unusual, but that wasn't exactly what she meant. Thank you, she said instead. He nodded and left, and she listened to his footsteps down the hall, and then sat in the quiet office for a few minutes before going back to the contracts. The apartment was still going to be empty. That hadn't changed, but something about the evening felt marginally less like carrying the whole thing alone, which was a small thing, and which she was aware was probably a dangerous thing to start counting on, and which she counted anyway. The board meeting lasted 4 hours. Serena had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, completely, methodically, with the particular thoroughness of someone who had learned early that walking into any room under-equipped was a mistake she couldn't afford. She had the audit report. She had the police report. She had the documentation trail of every personnel decision related to Richard Colton's access to financial systems, vendor relationships, and project records. She had a proposed timeline for the VP of Operations search and a framework for the oversight restructuring that addressed the board's legitimate concerns without conceding the ones she thought were wrong. She also had something she hadn't planned for. A statement from 4 senior project leads submitted voluntarily through the legal team the morning of the meeting, attesting to the quality of internal operations on their projects, and specifically noting that the irregularities identified in the audit had been invisible at the project level, not because of negligence, but because they'd been engineered to be invisible. One of the project leads was Phil Garrett, one was Marcus from the Henderson project, one was a woman from the Western region named Delgado who Serena had only spoken to twice, but who had apparently decided independently that the record should reflect something other than what the headlines implied. And one was Logan Mercer, whose statement was the shortest and the most specific, a careful technical accounting of the Henderson financial records and the points at which the projections had been modified and why the modifications had been designed to appear within normal variance ranges. She read all 4 statements the night before the meeting and then put them away because she needed to think clearly, and she could feel something interfering with that, something she didn't have the bandwidth to manage right now on top of everything else. She presented to the board. She answered questions. She accepted the decision to appoint an interim oversight committee for operations while a permanent VP was recruited. She pushed back successfully on the proposal to bring in outside management for the interim period, and she pushed back on it with the project lead's statements and the specific evidence that the core failures had been deliberate rather than systemic, and 2 of the 3 board members who'd been skeptical came around by hour 3. When it was over, she shook hands, said appropriate things, and walked out. In the hallway outside the boardroom, she stood for a moment and breathed. Dana appeared at her elbow. You need anything? Give me 5 minutes. She found a window at the end of the hall, looked out at the November city, and just stood there for 5 minutes doing nothing, not thinking about the next task, not reviewing the meeting, not cataloging what came next, just standing in the window. It wasn't enough. It was also all she had. She straightened up, turned back toward the office, and went back to work. What she didn't know yet, what the police investigation was slowly assembling from the evidence preserved in the Dalton building, from the server logs, from the vendor records, was that the scope of what Richard Colton had done was wider than the audit had found in its first pass. It was Logan who started to piece it together, not intentionally, not as any kind of heroic project, but because he was a craftsman who'd spent the past year working in proximity to the Henderson Project financials and had developed an intuitive familiarity with the numbers the way he developed familiarity with the structures he worked in. He knew how the numbers were supposed to look. He knew the normal range of variance. And now, going back through the records with the audit findings as a reference point, he started to notice something. The Henderson project had been manipulated, yes, but the manipulation pattern on Henderson was slightly different from the pattern on the other 3 projects in the audit. On the others, the irregularities were in vendor invoices and cost projections, money moving, essentially. On Henderson, the manipulation was in the documentation chain, small alterations to assessment reports, timeline records, personnel decision logs. Not the money, the story. He sat with that for 2 days before he understood why it mattered. The Henderson project had been the one where Logan was assigned. The documentation manipulation on Henderson wasn't about money. It was about creating a paper trail that would make Logan's advancement on the project appear irregular, faster than warranted, connected to decisions made above his grade level without standard review. Exactly what Richard had accused him of at the Gala, which meant Richard had been building that case before the Gala, had manufactured the evidence of favoritism that he'd then publicly pointed to in a room full of colleagues at an event that was being casually filmed. He'd set the stage and then lit the fire and waited for the documentation to confirm the accusation if anyone looked. And Serena had defended Logan before anyone could look. He sat with that understanding for a long time, in the quiet of his car outside the regional office, with Chloe due to be picked up in 40 minutes and the afternoon going gray around him. Richard had come after Serena by first coming after Logan, because Logan was close enough to Serena's professional attention to be useful and disposable enough, a craftsman, relatively new, without the institutional relationships that would protect him, to be sacrificed for a scandal. He'd been used, his work had been used, and Serena had stepped in front of it without knowing what it was, because that was apparently what she did when she saw something unfair, and it had cost her weeks of headlines and boardroom damage and a reputation under scrutiny. He pulled out his phone, called the auditing firm's contact number from the investigation file he'd been given access to, and told them what he'd found. The auditor on the line was quiet for a moment. "You're saying the Henderson documentation trail was altered to manufacture the appearance of the irregularity he publicly alleged?" "Yes." "And you found this by... I know the project. I know what the records are supposed to look like." He watched a group of pigeons on the office building roof across the street reorganize themselves against the wind. "I've been in those files for 14 months. Mr. Mercer, this could significantly expand the scope of the criminal investigation." "I know." "You understand that your testimony may be required." "I know." He said goodbye, put the phone down, and drove to get Chloe. She talked the whole way home about a disagreement she'd had with her best friend about whether dolphins were smarter than dogs, which she had firm opinions about, and Logan listened and responded and made the right noises, and somewhere in the middle of it, the tightness in his chest loosened slightly, the way it always did when Chloe was talking about something she cared about with the complete, unself-conscious commitment that 8-year-olds brought to things. He made pasta for dinner. She told him the dolphin theory required more research and she was going to need library books. He said, "Okay." They watched a nature documentary for 45 minutes and she fell asleep before it ended, which he'd expected. He sat in the quiet living room after she was down, thinking about documents and patterns, and the specific way people sometimes came after the things you'd built, not because they wanted what you had, but because they wanted you not to have it. He thought about Serena standing in that board meeting today, which he'd heard about third hand through Marcus, holding a company together that someone had been quietly taking apart from the inside for a year. He thought about calling her. He decided against it. He'd already been in her office once this week at 8:30 at night, and there was a line somewhere between showing up for someone and crowding them, and he wasn't entirely sure where it was, but he was pretty sure he needed to be careful about it. He went to bed. He slept better than he had in 2 weeks, which told him something, though he chose not to spend too long working out exactly what. The auditors called Serena with the expanded findings on a Wednesday morning. She listened to the summary without interrupting, asked 3 clarifying questions, and sat very still after the call ended. Then she pulled up the Gala video on her phone, the one she hadn't watched since the first week, the one she'd deliberately put away because watching it served no useful purpose. She watched it now, beginning to end. 90 seconds. Richard's deliberate, calibrated voice. Logan standing very still, her own voice cutting through. She understood now what she'd walked into that night, what Richard had constructed and what he'd been counting on, and what her instinct to defend someone being treated unfairly had cost her, not because the instinct was wrong, but because she'd walked into a trap that had been built before the event and baited specifically with a man she'd been paying attention to professionally because his work was genuinely exceptional. She thought about Logan finding the documentation pattern on Henderson, going through months of records on his own time, without being asked, because he understood the numbers and couldn't stop looking once he saw the shape of something wrong. She thought about the statement he'd submitted to the board. She picked up her phone and called him. He answered on the 3rd ring, clearly from a job site. She could hear the background noise she'd learned to identify. "The auditors told me what you found," she said, a brief pause. "Yeah. You didn't have to do that." "I know." "Logan." She stopped. There were several things she wanted to say, and most of them weren't appropriate for a phone call between a CEO and an employee, and one of them wasn't appropriate for anything she had time to deal with right now, and she was aware that she was standing in her office pressing a phone against her ear with more feeling than the professional situation called for. "Thank you. You already said that." "I know. I meant it the first time, too." There was a moment on the line, not silence exactly, more like the quality of air in a room when two people are deciding simultaneously whether to say something. "How'd the board meeting go?" he asked. "We survived it." "Good." "The investigation is going to get bigger before it gets resolved." "Probably." "You're going to have to give testimony." "I know, the auditors told me." He paused. "That's fine." "It's not... Logan, it's not a small thing. You'll be deposed. Your name will be... My name's already been in the news for something I didn't do." His voice was even. "Being in it for something I actually did seems like an improvement." She almost laughed, which surprised her enough that she stopped it before it happened. Almost. "I'll be in touch," she said. "Okay." She ended the call and stood in the November light coming through her office window and let herself feel, briefly and precisely, what she'd been not feeling all week. The loneliness of handling everything alone. The specific, unfamiliar warmth of someone who kept showing up without being asked, without calculation, without the expectation of anything in return. She filed it away. She had work to do, but she filed it carefully. The deposition was scheduled for the second week of December, 6 weeks after the gala, in a conference room at the law firm handling the criminal referral. Logan had never been deposed before. He'd testified in a civil case once, years ago, a contractor dispute that had nothing to do with him personally, and where his role was limited to describing what a specific piece of framing looked like before and after a water event. That had been 20 minutes in a small room in Virginia, and he'd found it procedurally tedious and emotionally neutral. This was different. He spent 4 hours with Serena's legal team the week before, going through the documentation he'd found, the specific alterations in the Henderson records, the pattern he'd identified by cross-referencing the original assessment files against the versions in the company's primary database. The attorney leading the session was a woman named Carver, sharp, methodical, the kind of person who asked the same question 3 different ways, not because she doubted you, but because she needed to understand exactly what you knew, versus what you'd inferred versus what you'd assumed. By the end of it, Logan had a cleaner picture of what he actually had. The evidence was solid. The documentation trail was clear. What he'd found wasn't circumstantial. It was the kind of specific, verifiable record that held up because it was grounded in technical detail that required expertise to fabricate and more expertise to identify. "You're a good witness," Carver said at the end, closing her folder. "I just know the project." "That's what makes you a good witness." She stood, shook his hand. "Don't minimize it. The technical foundation is exactly what this case needs." He drove home thinking about Richard Colton sitting in some lawyer's office somewhere, doing the same preparation from the other side. He found he didn't have much feeling about it. Not satisfaction, not anger, just the neutral acknowledgement of a process working the way it was supposed to work, eventually, after doing the damage it had done. He picked up Chloe from his mother's place. She'd lost a tooth that afternoon and had the gap tooth smile to prove it, and an extremely detailed account of how the tooth had come out during lunch, which involved a somewhat dramatic retelling that Logan suspected had been embellished with each telling. He listened to all 3 versions, let her put the tooth under her pillow that night, and sat at the kitchen table after she was asleep thinking about the deposition and the investigation and the board meeting and the fact that in 6 weeks his life had developed complications he hadn't asked for and couldn't quite untangle himself from. He didn't want to untangle himself. That was the part he was least comfortable with. Serena found out about the deposition prep through Carver, who reported to her legal team, who mentioned in passing that Mercer had been thorough and prepared, and that his technical testimony was likely to be among the strongest elements of the criminal referral. She acknowledged this professionally and moved on to the 17 other items on her agenda for that day. She thought about it that evening anyway, alone in the apartment, eating takeout she'd ordered and mostly not finished. The thing she kept coming back to wasn't the testimony itself, but the image of Logan spending his own time going back through records he had no obligation to review, finding something that nobody had asked him to find, and then calling the auditors and telling them precisely and without drama what he'd discovered. She'd known a lot of people in her professional life who were competent. She'd known fewer who were good, not in the performed, strategic way that competent people sometimes deployed goodness as a professional tool, but in the straightforward, inconvenient way that didn't calculate whether the right thing was also the advantageous thing before doing it. Logan Mercer was good in that second way, and she found it disorienting in a way she hadn't expected. She was 30 years old. She'd built something real and significant, and she'd done it by being excellent at her work and relentless in her focus, and willing to accept certain costs she'd told herself were temporary. The cost of being alone in an apartment eating takeout on a Wednesday night wasn't dramatic. It wasn't tragic. It was just the ordinary accumulation of choices, and she'd made peace with it the way you made peace with most things, by not looking at it too directly. She put the takeout in the refrigerator and went to bed and didn't think about it anymore, which worked moderately well. The Hendricks Group called on a Thursday morning 3 days before the deposition. Their legal team had reviewed the preliminary criminal findings. Their CFO had reviewed the audit. Their own due diligence team had spent 2 weeks independently assessing the cost projection irregularities in the original contract delay and confirmed that the numbers they'd been given had been manipulated before they received them, meaning the delay and the resulting breach of contract concern had been engineered, not earned. Their CEO, a man named Paul Hendricks, who Serena had met twice at industry conferences and found straightforwardly decent in the way that some people in business were, called her directly. "I owe you an apology," he said, which was not how she'd expected the conversation to start. We pulled out of a 3-year partnership based on numbers that we now know were falsified before they reached us. My team should have done more independent verification. We relied on internal veil data that turned out to have been tampered with." He paused. "That's partly on us." Serena sat with that for a moment. "The primary responsibility is with the person who tampered with it." "Sure. But I've been in business long enough to know that how you respond to a crisis tells you more about an organization than how they perform when everything's going well." He paused again. "The way you handled the board, the audit, the investigation, my general counsel has been tracking it. He thinks it's been handled correctly. Your general counsel's opinion means a lot to me." "Don't be like that." His voice had a mild, dry humor in it. "I'm trying to tell you we'd like to revisit the contract." She went still. "Revisit." "The original scope, the original timeline, adjusted for the delay. Our legal teams can work out the terms." He waited a beat. "Assuming you're still interested." "I'm still interested," she said. After the call, she sat in her office for 2 full minutes without doing anything. Then she called Dana and told her to start the contract revision process. Then she called Marcus Webb and told him, and listened to the particular sound of a 61-year-old board chairman exhaling with genuine relief. Then she sat for another minute and let herself feel it. Not triumph exactly, more like the specific grounded satisfaction of something that had been knocked over being put back upright. The Hendricks contract wasn't just revenue. It was the most visible symbol of what Richard's sabotage had cost her. Getting it back meant something. She thought about who she wanted to tell. She ran through the list quickly and accurately. Dana, Marcus, the legal team, the project leads who'd supported her at the board meeting. She caught herself thinking about Logan and stopped the thought before it fully formed. He didn't need to know about the Hendricks contract. He was an employee. He wasn't... She picked up her phone and put it back down. She had a meeting in 20 minutes. She went to it. She told him anyway. Not immediately. She let 3 days pass, and the deposition happened, and Carver reported that it had gone well. And the investigation moved into its formal criminal referral phase and out of the part that required Serena's daily attention. The company steadied. The days got marginally less loaded with emergency. She was walking through the Henderson site on a Tuesday afternoon for a scheduled project review when she ran into Logan coming in the opposite direction from the 3rd floor assessment. He had the assessment clipboard under his arm and was looking at his phone, which he put away when he saw her. "Hendricks is coming back," she said, without preamble. He looked at her. Something moved on his face. Genuine, unmanaged, the quick flash of someone hearing something good before they'd had time to compose a response to it. Yeah? They called last week. Contract revision starts next month. Serena. He said her name simply, the way he'd started occasionally saying it in the past few weeks, without the careful professional buffer that most people maintained. That's a good thing. It's a very good thing. She looked at the site around them, the restored framing, the newly shored wall from the emergency repair 3 weeks ago, the evidence of work done carefully and well on every surface. The project lead presentation to their team is in January. I want you on it. He looked at her. I'm not a project lead on Henderson. Formally. I know what you are formally. She met his eyes. I also know whose assessment work saved this project 6 different times in the past year. You can say no. I'm not going to say no. Good. She glanced down at the clipboard he was carrying. What's the 3rd floor look like? He turned and fell into step beside her, opening the clipboard, and spent the next 12 minutes walking her through the assessment findings with the specific, clear technical language he used when he was talking about work he knew well. She asked questions. He answered them. There was a back and forth between them in these conversations that had developed over the past month into something that felt easy in a way that professional relationships didn't usually feel easy, at least not in Serena's experience. No navigation required, no performance layer, just 2 people who understood the work talking about the work. She was aware of it. She'd been aware of it for a while. They were standing in front of the northeast wall looking at the repair section when he said, without looking at her, Chloe asked me last week who the woman from my job was. Serena turned to look at him. Why would she? She found the newspaper coverage, the early stuff, from after the gala. He kept his eyes on the wall. My mother had a printout. She didn't mean for Chloe to see it. What did you tell her? I told her you were someone I work with, someone who runs the company. He paused. She asked if you were nice. What did you say? He looked at her then, with the direct, undecorated expression she'd come to recognize as simply him. I said yes. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at the wall. That was generous. It was accurate. He closed the clipboard. She's 8 and she worries about things. I try not to give her more than she needs. What does she worry about? He was quiet for a moment. She worries about me mostly, in the way that kids whose parents went through something worry about the parent who's left. He said it matter-of-factly, not to generate sympathy, but just because she'd asked. She's getting better. She has more good days than hard ones now. But she pays attention to what's going on with me in a way that kids her age normally don't have to. Serena thought about that. She thought about an 8-year-old looking at a newspaper printout with a woman's face on it, connected to her father's name, trying to figure out what it meant. I'm sorry, she said, that my company's situation landed in your house. It's not your fault. I know. I'm still sorry. He nodded. They stood for a moment in the repaired room, the afternoon light coming through the temporary window coverings, and neither of them said anything, and it wasn't uncomfortable. Come to dinner, he said. It came out direct, not hedged, but she could hear the slight tension underneath it, not uncertainty exactly, more like a man who'd decided to say something and was saying it before he could rethink it. Chloe's been asking, and my mother would be there, and it's just dinner next Saturday. Serena looked at him. Logan, I know how it sounds. I know the position you're in with the board and the coverage, and this isn't. He stopped, and she could see him sorting through the ways to say it. You defended me when you didn't have to. You've been carrying this whole situation mostly alone. And you said I was generous for saying you were nice, but the word I used with Chloe was actually good. Not nice. He held her gaze. Come to dinner. It's pasta. Chloe picks the pasta shape, so I can't promise it'll be sophisticated. She almost said no. She had several practical, legitimate reasons to say no. The optics, the board, the ongoing coverage, the fundamental difficulty of any personal connection between a CEO and an employee during an active public relations crisis. She said, What shape does she usually pick? Something on his face shifted. Bow ties currently. She's going through a bow tie phase. Saturday, she said. What time? 6. Okay. She walked back toward the site stairs, and he went back to his assessment, and neither of them mentioned it again that afternoon, and she drove back to the office with the particular, slightly alarming awareness of having made a decision that she could not entirely explain through the usual logic she applied to decisions. She decided not to explain it. She was going to dinner. It was pasta. It was fine. But Saturday arrived with the gray, cold clarity of late November, the kind of day that made Philadelphia look like a painting of itself. Bare trees against pale sky, the streets quieter than weekday, the particular weekend stillness of a city taking a breath. Serena stood outside Logan's house at 5:58 and acknowledged that she was nervous, which was information she found both accurate and annoying. She was not typically a person who was nervous about dinner. She negotiated contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, presented to hostile board members, testified to investigators in formal proceedings. She was not nervous about pasta with bow ties. She rang the bell anyway. The door opened and a small person looked up at her with the complete unguarded assessment that children performed on adults before they'd learned to modulate it. Chloe had Logan's eyes, the same direct quality, the same lack of performance. She was wearing a shirt with a sea creature on it that Serena thought might be a mantis shrimp. "Hi," Chloe said. "Hi, I'm Serena." "I know, Dad showed me your picture, so I'd recognize you." She stepped back from the door. "Come in. He burned the garlic bread, but he's pretending he didn't." Logan's voice came from somewhere toward the kitchen. "I did not burn the garlic bread." "It's definitely darker than last time," Chloe called back. She looked at Serena with the conspiratorial seriousness of someone sharing important intelligence. "It's still good. He gets defensive about cooking." "I can hear you," Logan said. Serena stepped inside. The house was the kind of house that was lived in rather than decorated. Bookshelves that had too many books for their shelves, a jacket on the back of a chair, Chloe's homework spread across one end of the dining table, a small collection of things on the kitchen counter that included a coffee maker that had seen significant use and a drawing taped to the cabinet that looked like an octopus. Logan was at the stove, and he turned when she came in, and something in his expression when he saw her was quickly composed into the more normal version of itself, which she filed away and chose not to examine in front of his daughter. "The garlic bread is fine," he said. "The garlic bread smells good," Serena said. "See?" Logan said to Chloe. "She's being polite," Chloe said, in a tone that suggested she considered politeness a suspect quality in otherwise reasonable adults. Serena laughed. It came out real, uncalculated, the kind that surprised her when it happened. Chloe looked at her with a slightly pleased expression, as if she'd correctly predicted an outcome. Logan's mother, a woman in her early 60s named Ruth, who had the same unhurried quality her son had, but with an additional layer of warmth that came with age and fewer complications, arrived from the back of the house and shook Serena's hand with the easy directness of someone who had decided ahead of time to simply be normal about this. "You look like you could use a glass of wine and a night off," Ruth said, by way of greeting. "Mom," Logan said, "that's a compliment. She looks tired." "It's fine," Serena said. "She's not wrong." Ruth handed her a glass of red wine with the satisfied air of someone whose assessment had been confirmed, and Serena stood in the kitchen of Logan Mercer's house, and Chloe explained to her in considerable detail why mantis shrimps had the most sophisticated vision of any known animal, and Logan finished the pasta and plated it without burning anything else, and his mother set the table, and Serena helped fold the napkins because she was standing near them when they needed to be folded, and it seemed like the natural thing to do. Dinner was loud in the way that small family dinners were loud. Chloe dominated the conversation for the first 20 minutes with a school project, and Ruth had opinions about the city council that she shared comprehensively, and Logan ate his food and occasionally redirected the conversation with the practiced ease of someone who'd been managing this particular household for years. Serena mostly listened, which was unusual for her. She was typically the person steering things, but found that listening here was easy, that the conversation didn't require her to perform or manage or lead, that she could just sit at a table with people and be in the noise of it. At some point, Chloe asked, "Do you have kids?" "Chloe," Logan said. "What?" "It's a normal question." "It's fine," Serena said. She looked at Chloe. "No, I don't." "Do you want some?" "Chloe, Dad, it's a normal thing to ask. Serena considered the question, which Chloe had asked with the sincere, uncomplicated directness that made it impossible to give anything other than a real answer. I haven't thought about it much, she said honestly. I've been pretty focused on other things. Chloe considered this with visible seriousness. That's okay, she said finally, with the generosity of someone granting absolution. Dad was like that for a long time too. He's better now. Logan set down his fork. I'm right here. I know. Chloe looked at him. I'm not saying anything bad. I'm saying you got better. She turned back to Serena with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone reporting observable fact. He used to not talk to people very much, like outside of work. He just worked and then came home and worked on stuff at home. She ate a bow tie pasta. Now he talks more. Serena didn't look at Logan because she was fairly certain she'd catch something on his face that neither of them would know what to do with in front of an 8-year-old and his mother. Working a lot isn't always bad, Serena said. I know, he made sure we always had stuff, but he was kind of lonely. Chloe said it simply, without cruelty. I think lonely is bad even if you have stuff. The table was quiet for a moment. That's true, Serena said. After dinner, Ruth and Chloe cleared the table with the efficiency of a long-established system, and Logan walked Serena to the small back porch that looked over the yard while the dishes were being done. It was cold, and their breath showed in the air, and the yard was brown and quiet in the November dark. She's not subtle, Logan said. No. Serena looked at the yard. She's wonderful. She's terrifying. She's going to be running something someday, and I don't know if the world is ready. Serena smiled. She felt the wine and the warmth of the house behind her, and the cold air on her face, and the particular quality of standing next to someone in the dark without needing to fill it with anything. She's right, though, Serena said carefully. About lonely being bad even if you have stuff. Logan looked at her from the side. She's 8. 8-year-olds observe things adults have learned to stop seeing. She pulled her jacket tighter against the cold. I've been building things for so long that I think I forgot to notice what I wasn't building. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what do you think you weren't building? She thought about it. It was the kind of question she'd normally deflect or answer with a formulation that was true but protected, something that gestured at vulnerability without committing to it. She was standing in someone's backyard in the cold and had just watched a small girl eat bow tie pasta and tell her she seemed lonely without any apparent awareness that it was a devastating thing to say. I'm not sure, she said. I'm starting to figure it out. He didn't push it further, which she appreciated. They stood for another minute in the cold, and then Ruth called something from inside about coffee, and they went back in. 3 weeks later, the criminal referral was formally accepted by the DA's office, and Richard Colton was arrested at his sister's house in Connecticut, where he'd apparently been staying since clearing out his office. The news broke on a Wednesday morning, and Serena heard about it from her attorney before she heard about it from the media, which was a small victory of preparation. By noon, 4 outlets had run the story. By evening, the narrative had shifted. From CEO possibly connected to employee to CEO uncovers internal sabotage, cooperates with criminal investigation. The board issued a statement expressing full confidence in Serena's leadership. 3 investors who'd been quietly cautious since the Gala video sent emails that contained varying degrees of apology wrapped in business language. She read them all and answered them all with professional precision and felt, about all of it, a kind of distance. Not detachment exactly, more like the perspective you got once a thing was over and you could see the whole shape of it rather than just the part you were standing in. The part she found herself thinking about most wasn't the arrest or the board statement or the investors. It was a specific memory from the Saturday dinner that kept surfacing with the persistence of something that hadn't been fully processed. Logan standing at the stove, his back to the room, listening to his daughter explain mantis shrimp vision to a CEO who had arrived nervous and left full, and the way the ordinary, imperfect warmth of that house had felt more real than anything she'd been inside in longer than she wanted to calculate. She had a company to stabilize, and a Hendricks contract to finalize, and a VP of operations to hire, and a very full calendar through the end of the year. She was not going to do anything impulsive or professionally complicated. She texted Logan at 7:30 that evening. Just, "They got him." His response came back in 4 minutes. "Good." Then a minute later, "You okay?" She looked at the question for a long moment in the quiet of her apartment. "Getting there," she typed back. The 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Then, "Chloe wants to know if you're coming back for dinner." For the record, I didn't prompt that. Serena looked at her phone for a beat too long, alone in her clean and quiet apartment, with the city lit up outside her window and the remains of another solo dinner on the counter. "Tell her yes," she wrote. She put the phone down and looked at the ceiling and thought about what she was doing, which was a complicated question that she could not fully answer, and about the fact that she was apparently going back for dinner with a family that felt more like something real than most things she'd been inside in years. The company was steady. The investigation was resolved. The worst was over. She fell asleep before 10 for the first time in 6 weeks. She went back for dinner the following Saturday, and the one after that. It wasn't a decision so much as a series of small continuations. Chloe texted through Logan's phone once, a message that said simply, "Are you coming this week?" with no punctuation, and a photo of a bow tie pasta box that she'd apparently held up to the camera to make her case. And Serena had looked at it in the back of a car between 2 meetings and felt something crack loose in her chest in a way that was inconvenient and completely beyond her management. She went. She brought wine the first time, a good bottle that Ruth accepted with the unpretentious approval of someone who appreciated the gesture without making a production of it. The second time she brought a library book about marine animals that she'd found in a bookstore near her office, because Chloe had mentioned wanting more research material on mantis shrimps, and Serena had been walking past the store, and the book had been in the window, and there was no real analysis available for why she'd gone in. Chloe received the book with the serious gratitude of someone being given a professional resource. She said thank you once, clearly and directly, and then immediately opened it to the index, which Serena thought was probably the most genuine thank you she'd ever received. "You didn't have to do that," Logan said, in the kitchen after Chloe had retreated to the living room with the book. "I know. She's going to quote it at me for weeks. That was somewhat the goal." He looked at her with the expression that she'd catalogued over the past month, the one that was slightly warmer than professional and slightly more careful than personal, living in the careful space between those two things where they'd both apparently agreed to exist for now. She understood the carefulness. She shared it. They were both people who had learned the cost of moving without adequate assessment, and both, she suspected, privately aware that assessment was becoming harder to maintain the more time they spent in the same room. She didn't push it. Neither did he. They ate dinner and talked about the Henderson project and the Hendricks contract timeline, and once, briefly, about a documentary Ruth had watched about bridge restoration that had led Ruth to ask Logan 17 structural questions he'd answered with more patience than Serena thought she could have managed. It was ordinary in a way that felt almost transgressive to her, given the shape of her usual evenings. She drove home both nights thinking about what she was doing and not resolving the question, which was not her typical approach to anything, and which she suspected was itself a kind of answer. January brought the Hendricks presentation. The contract revision had been finalized in the last week of December, 12 days of legal back and forth that Serena had overseen personally, making sure the terms reflected the reality of the delay without penalizing the project team for conditions they hadn't caused. The final number was actually slightly better than the original, because the construction market had moved and the Hendricks Group, in their particular form of institutional apology, had agreed to updated materials costs without the usual fight. The presentation to the Hendricks executive team was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at their headquarters downtown. Serena had put together a team of 4, herself, the lead project architect, the financial director, and Logan. She told him about it in December, standing on the Henderson site, and watched him process the information with the careful, slightly braced quality of someone recalibrating what they thought their role was. "I'm still not formally a project lead," he'd said. "You'll be formally a senior project consultant by January 2nd. HR is processing the paperwork." He'd looked at her. "You promoted me." The performance record justified it. It was past due. She'd kept her voice professionally even. The Hendricks team specifically asked for the person whose assessment work underpinned the Henderson structural reports. "That's you." "Serena." It's not personal, Logan. The promotion and the presentation are both based on documented performance. She'd paused. They're also not personal. I'm not going to pretend I don't know you, but the record stands on its own. He'd been quiet for a moment. Okay. Okay? I said, okay. A slight expression. You expected me to argue. I expected you to be uncomfortable with it. I'm a little uncomfortable with it. He'd picked up the assessment clipboard. I'll get over it. He'd gotten over it by the time January arrived, or at least he'd put it somewhere functional. The presentation prep had been thorough, 4 sessions over 2 weeks, going through the project timeline, the structural findings, the repair methodology, the forward projections. Logan was not a natural presenter in the boardroom sense. He didn't have the glossy fluency of people who'd spent careers in meeting rooms. What he had was the authority of someone who knew the material at a depth that no amount of polish could replicate, and when the Hendrix team's chief engineer started asking technical questions that went well beyond the presentation deck, Logan answered them with the straightforward precision that Serena had watched him apply to everything, and the chief engineer visibly relaxed into the conversation in the way that engineers did when they realized they were talking to someone who actually understood what they were talking about. Paul Hendrix caught Serena's eye across the table near the end of the meeting, and something in his expression was the satisfied acknowledgement of a man who had made the right call in coming back to the table. The contract was signed that afternoon. The office that evening was quieter than usual. Most of the team had left by 6, celebrating in the way company wins were celebrated. A group dinner that Serena had sent them to with her blessing and genuine warmth and a credit card authorization that she'd given Dana before slipping out herself. She didn't feel like a group dinner. She felt like the particular quietness of a thing concluded, the aftermath of sustained effort that had been running in the background of everything for 3 months. She was at her desk reviewing the signed contract documents when she heard the knock. Logan was in the doorway, jacket on, clearly on his way out. "You didn't go with the team," he said. "You didn't either." "I have to pick up Chloe." He paused. "You okay?" "You ask me that a lot." "You give me a lot of reason to." She looked at him for a moment. "It's done," she said. "The contract's signed. The investigation is in prosecution. The board is stable. The Henderson project is on track. It's actually done." "How does that feel?" She thought about it honestly. "Quiet," she said. "It feels quiet. I've been in crisis management mode for 3 months, and now I'm just sitting here, and the crisis is over, and I don't entirely know what to do with the quiet." "That's a real thing," he said. "After something hard, the absence of it takes some adjustment." "Speaking from experience?" He looked at the floor for a second, then back at her. "Yeah." She understood what he meant without him having to say it more specifically. The aftermath of grief, the strange emptiness of a life that had rearranged itself around loss and then had to find its shape again. She didn't press it. "Congratulations," he said. "On the contract. You earned it. Your whole team did." "So did you." "I answered some questions." "You answered 3 technical questions that were specifically designed to determine whether this company knew its own work, and you answered them so thoroughly that their chief engineer asked if you'd be available for a site consultation in March." She watched his face. "He's going to send a formal request through the company." Something moved across Logan's expression. Not vanity, more the quiet, private version of satisfaction that came from work being recognized by someone who understood it. He caught it and composed it back to neutral, but she'd seen it, and she thought she probably always would now, the real thing moving underneath the careful surface. "Tell him I'm available," Logan said. "I will." She stood, picked up her bag. "Go get Chloe." He nodded and turned to leave, and she was going to let him, and then she said, "Logan." He stopped. "Saturday." She wasn't entirely sure what she was asking for, and she suspected he knew that, and she said it anyway. "Is the invitation still open?" He turned back. The look on his face was the careful, honest one, not playing anything up, not performing the response, just being in it. "It's always open," he said. She nodded, and he left, and she stood in the quiet office with the signed contract on her desk and the city going dark outside her window, and let herself be in the quiet for a minute instead of filling it. It was different from the empty quiet of the apartment. This was the quiet of something that was about to change, and she knew it, and she was not afraid of it, which was itself a change. February moved differently than January. The Hendricks project entered its active phase, which meant Logan was splitting his time between Henderson and the first Hendricks site assessment, which meant more contact with Serena's project office, which meant they were in the same rooms more often in a professional capacity that had become genuinely difficult to keep cleanly professional. Not because of anything inappropriate. Every interaction was documented, every assignment went through standard channels. The promotion paperwork was airtight, and based on a performance record that anyone could audit and find unimpeachable. It was more subtle than that. It was the way a room changed quality when he walked into it, the specific texture of a conversation with him versus a conversation with anyone else she worked with. The fact that she caught herself thinking about things she wanted to tell him that had nothing to do with work and everything to do with the ordinary currency of days. A news item she'd read, something Chloe had said at the last Saturday dinner that was still making her smile. The way the city looked at 6 a.m. on a clear February morning. She didn't tell him most of these things. She told him some of them. The line between those categories was moving, and she was aware it was moving, and she was not doing anything about it, which was its own kind of doing something. The Saturday dinners had become fixed, not formally fixed. There was no conversation in which they'd said, "This is a thing we're doing." It just became the architecture of her week in the way that certain things became architecture before you'd made a conscious decision to build them. She went. She helped with dinner sometimes, badly, because she was genuinely not a skilled cook, and Chloe found this hilarious and instructive in equal parts. She sat at the table and ate too salty soup that Chloe had seasoned herself in pasta in whatever shape Chloe had selected that week, and felt, persistently and without being able to argue herself out of it, more at home than she felt in her actual home. Ruth, who was perceptive in a way she mostly kept to herself, said to Serena once, in the kitchen while Logan was helping Chloe with something in the other room, "He hasn't had anyone to talk to. Since Maya. Not really. He has me, but that's different." She said it without loading it, just reporting. "I'm glad he has someone." Serena hadn't known what to say to that. "I'm glad too," she'd said, which was true and insufficient and the best she had. Ruth had nodded, satisfied, and gone back to the dishes. The conversation happened on a Saturday evening in late February, after dinner, after Chloe had gone to bed, after Ruth had made her usual early exit with the tactfulness of a woman who understood more than she said. They were in the kitchen, Serena washing the last of the pans because she'd insisted on doing something useful, Logan drying and putting away, and the house was quiet around them in the way it got after Chloe went down, the specific occupied quiet of a home that had a sleeping child in it. "Can I ask you something?" Logan said. "Yes." "What happens after the Hendricks project for you?" He set a pan on the shelf, turned back. "Where does the company go?" She thought about it. "Growth, carefully. The operations VP starts next month. Good candidate. Came from outside the industry, which I think is actually an asset. The board is stable. The Hendricks project is the signature contract we needed." She paused. "What's the actual question?" He looked at her directly. "The actual question is what you want. Not the company. You." She was quiet for a moment, hands still in the soapy water. It was the kind of question that required an honest answer, or no answer, and she'd been moving toward honest answers with him for months now, long enough that deflection felt like an active choice rather than a default. "I want the company to be what it's supposed to be," she said. "I built it because I believed in what it does. The work, the people, the actual physical fact of taking something broken and making it whole again. I still believe in that." She looked at the window over the sink, the dark yard beyond it. "I think I also want—" She stopped, then continued. "I want Saturdays, more of them, different from what my Saturdays have been." She heard him set down the dish towel. She didn't turn around yet. "Serena." His voice was careful, the way it was when he was about to say something that mattered and was giving it the appropriate weight. "I know what I'm about to say," she said, "and I know the complications. I've been through them in my head about 40 times. What do the 40 times conclude?" She turned then. He was standing 3 feet away, and his expression was the most unguarded she'd ever seen it. Not performing calm, not managing the moment, just being in it fully, which she'd come to understand was the most significant thing Logan Mercer offered, the simple and rare willingness to be fully present in something without a safety net. They conclude that the complications are real and manageable, she said, and that I've been building things all my life and I'm 30 years old and I'm tired of the specific kind of tired that comes from doing it alone. He crossed the 3 feet without drama, without anything that would have looked significant from the outside, just moved into the space between them and looked at her from close range with the same directness he brought to everything. I'm not easy, he said. I come with a lot. Chloe, and my mother's opinions, and a job that takes up most of my hands and about half my brain. And I'm not someone who moves fast. After Maya, I spent a long time understanding what I had left and whether it was enough to offer anyone. He paused. I think it is. I think you're someone I want to offer it to, but you should know what you're deciding. I know what I'm deciding. You've been doing it for a month at least. Longer than that, she said honestly. Something in his face shifted, not changed, more like it finally stopped working to hold its shape and just became what it was, which was warm and real and a little undone, which she thought might be the most accurate way to describe what she felt looking at it. He kissed her the way she might have predicted if she'd been predicting, without theater, without the cinematic buildup, just the direct, unhurried fact of it, his hands briefly on her face, and then one moving to her shoulder and holding there. And it was the simplest and most significant thing that had happened to her in years, which she didn't think about until after, because during she was just in it. When they separated, he stayed close. The board, he said. I'll handle the board. The coverage is going to be what it's going to be. She looked at him. I defended you in a room full of people when I barely knew you because it was the right thing to do. I think I can manage a board conversation about a relationship I actually chose. You're not worried. I'm plenty worried. She pulled back just enough to see his face. I'm choosing it anyway. He looked at her for a long moment, and then his mouth curved in the real version of his smile, the one she'd only seen a handful of times. Not the polite, managed version, but the one that made him look briefly, entirely like himself. Okay, he said. Okay, she agreed. Come, she told Marcus Webb on a Monday morning in his office with the direct approach she used for difficult conversations. She told him what it was, how long it had been developing, and what she'd done and planned to do to ensure the professional integrity of the working relationship. She told him Logan's role would continue to be assessed by the same oversight committee that had been established post-Colton with no direct reporting line to her, and that she was prepared to provide the board with whatever documentation structure they considered appropriate. Marcus listened to all of it without interrupting, which was how he listened when something was important. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You know there are going to be people who revisit the Gala video, he said. Yes. Some of them will say it confirms what they assumed from the beginning. Some of them will. They'll be wrong about the chronology, but they'll say it. And you're prepared for that. I've been prepared for things I didn't choose. I'm more prepared for this. She met his eyes. I'm telling you because you deserve to know directly, not because I'm asking permission. Marcus studied her for a moment. I know that. He picked up his pen, looked at it, set it down. He's a good man. It was simply said, without editorial, just the honest observation of someone who'd been paying attention. Yes, Serena said, he is. And you're the best thing that's happened to this company and the hardest working person I've seen in 40 years of business, and you've been running on empty for a long time. He picked up his pen again. I don't see a conflict. I see a CEO who has a personal life, which is something you've needed for longer than you've been willing to admit. She didn't say anything for a second. Thank you, Marcus. Don't thank me. Do the work. He opened the folder on his desk. Was there anything else? There wasn't. Spring arrived the way Philadelphia springs arrived, grudgingly at first, then all at once, the trees going from nothing to green in a week, the light changing quality in the mornings and staying past 6 in the evenings, and making the city feel like a different version of itself. The Henderson project was completed in March, on schedule, 20 days ahead of the revised deadline. The final walkthrough was on a Thursday afternoon. Serena, the project architect, the Hendricks team representative, and Logan, who moved through the completed spaces with the particular focused attention of someone accounting for everything that had gone into them. The building was good. She could see it in the quality of the finished work, and in the way Logan moved through the rooms. Not seeking problems, just taking inventory, verifying that what had been done was what it was supposed to be. He stopped once near the northeast wall on the third floor, the repaired wall, the one that had been compromised in the original assessment and that his shoring plan had saved, and put his hand flat against the plaster for a moment. She watched him do it and didn't say anything. Later, outside, while the Hendricks representative and the architect were finishing their walk-through notes, she stood beside him on the pavement and looked up at the building. "Good?" she asked. "Good," he said. He meant it fully. She thought about what this building had been when they'd first looked at it together. Compromised, sabotaged, the sight of a fire and a locked door, and a night she still occasionally dreamed about, in the way she dreamed about things that had genuinely frightened her. And what it was now, complete, solid, standing properly in the light. She thought that was probably a thing worth noting. "The crew did good work," Logan said. "They did." She paused. "You did." He looked sideways at her. "I fixed a wall." "You fixed about 40 walls and found evidence that protected this company and testified in a criminal case and made your daughter the best-informed person on mantis shrimp vision in the greater Philadelphia area." She kept her tone even. "Don't undersell it." He made a sound that was close to a laugh, the real kind, and she felt it somewhere in the center of her chest the way she'd started feeling most things about him. Not with surprise anymore, just with the steady acknowledgement of something that had become part of the daily landscape. The Hendricks representative appeared with his hand extended. Serena shook it. They exchanged the professional warmth of people who'd built something together through more difficulty than planned, and the representative drove away, and the architect followed, and Serena and Logan were left on the pavement in the spring afternoon. "Saturday," she said. "Chloe wants to try making dumplings. I've told her it's ambitious." "Is she going to do it anyway?" "She's already watched 4 videos. Serena smiled. "I'll be there at 6. He looked at her in the afternoon light, and the look on his face was the open one, the real one, the version of him that had taken months to earn and that she understood was not given easily and that she intended going forward to take care of. "Drive safe," he said. "You too." She drove back to the office through the spring city, the windows down, the air cool, and carrying the specific smell of a season changing, and thought about the months behind her, Seb. The gala and the fire and the boardroom and the investigation and the dinners and the kitchen and all of it, and felt something she'd spent a long time not feeling, which was the particular grounded warmth of a life that had other people in it. Not because she'd finished building. She wasn't finished building, wouldn't be, probably ever. The company was growing and the work was real and she was still herself, still driven in the specific way she'd always been driven. But she was driving back to an office where she'd leave by 6 today, because there was a dinner on Saturday that she was already looking forward to, and a man who said what he meant, and an 8-year-old who was going to make dumplings whether or not anyone thought it was a good idea. The light was good. The city looked like itself. She turned up the radio and drove. The dumplings were, objectively, a partial disaster. Chloe had watched the videos. She had taken notes, actual notes, in a small spiral notebook she'd designated for cooking projects, which Logan had discovered on the kitchen counter and found both impressive and slightly alarming. She had a plan. The plan did not survive contact with dumpling wrapper dough, which required a specific technique she had confidently assumed she understood and discovered, after the 3rd wrapper tour, that she did not. Serena arrived at 6 to find flour on the counter, flour on Chloe, flour on the edge of Logan's shirt where he'd apparently been drafted into the process, and a situation that had clearly moved past recipe and into improvisation. "We're adapting," Chloe announced, before Serena had taken off her jacket. "I can see that." "The wrappers are the problem. Dad thinks we should use the store ones." "The store ones work fine," Logan said from the stove, with the careful neutrality of a man who had already lost this argument once. "The store ones are cheating. The store ones are practical." Chloe looked at Serena with the expression of someone seeking a tie-breaking vote. Serena looked at the state of the counter, looked at the bowl of filling that was actually fine, looked at Chloe's flour-dusted face and the absolute commitment in her eyes. "Can I try the dough?" Serena asked. Chloe handed her a piece. Serena worked it between her fingers, assessed it the way she'd learned to assess materials over a career that was fundamentally about understanding what things were made of. "It needs more water," she said. "Just a little. The ratio's slightly off." Chloe stared at her. "How do you know that?" "I've built things for a long time. You learn how materials feel." She handed the dough back. "Try a tablespoon of water, mix it through, and let it rest for 10 more minutes." Chloe considered this, looked at Logan with an expression that said she reserved judgment on whether this was real expertise or polite encouragement, and then went back to the bowl. Logan caught Serena's eye across the kitchen. Something in his expression was warm and quiet and very sure, and she looked at it for only a second before turning to wash her hands at the sink, because looking at it longer than a second in front of Chloe required a composure she didn't currently have. The dumplings worked. Not perfectly. Some of them came out misshapen, one side thicker than the other, a few that split slightly in the pan. But the filling was good and they tasted like the real thing, and Chloe ate 4 of them with the focused satisfaction of someone consuming the evidence of a theory proven. "They're good," Chloe said. "They're very good," Serena said. "Dad thought we should just order pizza." "I suggested pizza as a backup," Logan said. "A contingency. That's responsible planning. It would have been giving up. It would have been eating." Chloe looked at Serena again. "He does this. When something is hard, he wants to find the easier version." "That's not—" Logan stopped. "That's not consistently true." "It's a little true," Serena said. He looked at her. "You've known me 7 months. 7 months is enough." She ate another dumpling. "You're also the person who went back through 18 months of financial records at night, on your own time, because you saw a pattern that nobody asked you to find. So it's not all of you, just the cooking contingency part." Ruth, who had been quiet for most of dinner in the way she was quiet when she was absorbing something and filing it away, made a small sound that might have been a laugh and refilled her wine. After dinner, after Chloe had gone to bed and Ruth had excused herself with the usual comfortable tact, Serena helped Logan clean up the kitchen. They'd been doing this for months now. The easy division of the task, no negotiation required, just moving around each other in the kitchen space like people who had learned each other's patterns. It still struck her sometimes, the ease of it. She wasn't someone who found most things easy. "She's testing you," Logan said, handing her the last bowl to dry. "I know. Not maliciously. She just—" He paused, looking for the right way to say it. "She lost her mother when she was 4. She doesn't remember enough of it to have grief the way adults have grief. What she has is this." He gestured, imprecise. "Watchfulness. She looks for permanence. She needs to know if something is going to last before she lets herself count on it." Serena dried the bowl and set it on the shelf. "What does the testing look like when it gets more serious?" More direct questions. She asked Maya's sister once, about a year after, whether she was going to stop visiting. Just like that. The woman cried, and Chloe felt terrible, but she needed to know. "Did the sister stop visiting?" "No." He leaned against the counter. "She comes every few months. Chloe likes her. It's—" He looked at the floor briefly. "It's complicated, that relationship. Good complicated. Maya's family stayed in our lives because they love Chloe, and I love them for that. And sometimes it's also hard because—" He stopped. "Because she looks like her mother," Serena said. He looked up. "Yeah." She held his gaze. This was the territory they'd moved into carefully over the past months. The parts of his life that had weight and shape and were not simple, the grief that didn't announce itself but lived in the background of ordinary days. She hadn't tried to understand it all at once, and he hadn't tried to explain it all at once, and that pacing had felt right to both of them in a way that probably said something about where they both came from. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. It was simple, and she meant it with the full weight of someone who understood what a statement like that cost to make, and make honestly. Logan looked at her with the steady, unperformed directness that she'd come to understand was his version of being completely open. "I know," he said. She believed that he did. Duh. Richard Colton's trial began in April and concluded in 6 days. The evidence was thorough and technical, and the defense's primary strategy, that the documentation alterations were the result of a system error that Colton had simply failed to report, collapsed under the specific testimony of 2 forensic accountants and Logan's detailed accounting of the Henderson records. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. The verdict covered 6 counts, including fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and willful destruction of company property in connection with the Dalton fire. Serena sat in the courtroom for the verdict on a Thursday afternoon in the second row behind the prosecution's table, between her attorney and Dana. When the jury foreperson read the verdict, she didn't feel triumph. She'd been expecting triumph, had assumed, given how much the past 6 months had cost her, that the conclusion of it would arrive with some corresponding relief that felt like victory. What she felt instead was tired. And then, under the tired, something quieter, a kind of settling. The long-sustained tension of the past months releasing finally into something that felt less like winning and more like the simple, factual ending of a thing that had done real damage and was now being accounted for. She accepted her attorney's handshake. She thanked Detective Reyes, who was standing in the corridor outside, and who shook her hand with the matter-of-fact satisfaction of someone who had done their job correctly. She spoke briefly with a journalist she'd agreed in advance to give a short statement to. 3 sentences, prepared, professional, acknowledging the verdict and the investigation and the work of the legal team. She texted Logan from the car. Verdict came in, all 6 counts. His response, "Good. Are you okay?" She thought about it. Tired, she typed. But yes. A pause, then, "Come to dinner tonight. Nothing formal. Chloe made soup yesterday, and there are leftovers that she is very proud of." She smiled at her phone in the back of the car. "What kind of soup?" "She's calling it ocean soup. It has shrimp in it. I assume you understand the thematic connection." "I'll be there at 7, she wrote back. The soup was intensely seasoned and slightly oversalted, and Chloe explained every ingredient with the seriousness of a chef describing a tasting menu, and Serena ate 2 full bowls and meant it. Logan sat across the table and watched her eat, and Chloe talk, and something in the whole arrangement, the small kitchen, the loud child, the reliable presence of Ruth in the corner chair with her book, was so ordinary and so specifically real that Serena felt the last of the courtroom tension drain out of her somewhere between the first and second bowl. She stayed until 9, which was later than usual. Chloe had fallen asleep on the couch watching something about marine biology, and Logan had carried her to bed without waking her, which Serena watched from the doorway of the living room. The practiced ease of a parent who'd done this 1,000 times, the way Chloe's head went to his shoulder without her waking, trusting the carrying completely. She thought about what Chloe had said months ago, quietly and without cruelty. "I think lonely is bad, even if you have stuff." She'd been right. She was right the way children were sometimes right, without the protective layers of sophistication adults built around difficult truths, just the plain fact of it sitting in the open. Logan came back to the living room and found Serena still standing in the doorway. "She's out," he said. "I noticed." She turned. "She's lucky. Having you. She's patient with me is what she is." He sat down on the couch where Chloe had been, looking tired in the honest way of a man at the end of a long week. Most 8-year-olds, after everything she's been through. He shook his head. "She just gets up. Every day, she just gets up." "She learned it from someone." He looked at her. "Don't do that." "I'm not flattering you. I'm observing." She sat beside him. "You get up every day, too. After everything you've been through this year alone, and the years before it. That's not nothing." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the spring night was doing its soft, dark thing, the sound of the neighborhood settling, a car passing, somewhere distant, a dog. "I didn't think it would look like this," he said eventually. "What would?" "Being okay again." He looked at the coffee table, at his hands. "After Maya. I thought it was the absence of the hard stuff. I thought you got to okay by getting through enough of the hard stuff that it stopped being present all the time." He paused. "It's not that. Okay it's this. It's Chloe making ocean soup, and my mother having opinions about city planning, and you sitting here telling me I get up every day like it means something." She looked at him. It means something. Yeah. He met her eyes. That's what I'm saying. She took his hand on the couch, and he turned his palm and held hers, and they sat in the living room of his ordinary, imperfect house while his daughter slept down the hall, and the spring night continued outside, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and it was more than enough. Summer came in quickly that year. June arrived with heat and the particular city energy of a season people had been waiting for. The streets filling up on weekends, the job sites busy with the long light of long days. The Hendricks project had moved into its second phase, which put Logan on a new site 3 days a week, in addition to his oversight role on Henderson's punch list completion. He was managing a larger crew than he'd ever managed, which he handled by being exactly the same person he was when he was alone in a room with a structural problem. Focused, precise, more concerned with getting the answer right than with looking like he already had it. His crew knew this about him. New crew members usually figured it out within a week. There was a particular kind of respect that came from people who worked with their hands for a long working man who also worked with his hands. Not the respect of performance or authority, but the specific regard of people who could see quality and had decided they were looking at it. Serena saw the second Hendricks site for the first time in late June, when she did a scheduled executive walkthrough with Paul Hendricks and 2 of his team leads. Logan was on site. He met them at the entrance in his hard hat, went through the progress summary with the Hendricks team with the unhurried authority she'd watched him develop over the months since the January presentation, answered 2 questions from the structural engineer that required him to pull out drawings and explain in specific detail, and then walked them through the site itself with the practiced patience of someone who loved the work too much to rush the explanation of it. Afterward, while the Hendricks team was finishing their notes, Paul Hendricks stood beside Serena looking at the site and said, without preamble, "He's the real thing." She looked at Logan across the site, crouched next to a foundation section explaining something to a crew member, his hands moving to demonstrate scale. "Yes," she said. "He is." Paul glanced at her sideways with the slight smile of a man who had understood more than he was being told. "Good for you," he said simply. She didn't confirm or deny anything, which was itself confirmation, and Paul Hendricks was too intelligent to need the words. What? The question of what they were to each other, formally, publicly, had been navigated carefully and was now simply settled, in the way things settled when the people involved had decided quietly and without drama that this was the shape of their lives. The board knew. She'd addressed it with the Oversight Committee in March, provided documentation, established clear professional boundaries, and received the response she'd anticipated from Marcus, measured acceptance, and the response she'd expected from 2 other board members, which was pointed questions she'd answered directly, and which had produced no formal objection once the performance record and governance structure were clearly presented. The media knew, or the media had guessed, or the media had published 2 items about it in spring, one carefully hedged, one less so, and Serena had issued no statement and Logan had given no comment, and after 2 weeks it had mostly stopped being a story because there was nothing to investigate. What there was a CEO and a senior project consultant in a relationship that had been disclosed to the board and structured with appropriate oversight, which was not a story that generated sustained interest. The Gala video had been recontextualized in ways she found both accurate and slightly funny. The same 90 seconds that had generated governance concerns headlines in November was now being cited in a few business publications as an example of an executive's instinct about talent being vindicated by subsequent events. She didn't endorse that version either. What had happened at the Gala was simpler than any narrative made it. She'd seen something unfair and acted on it. The rest had unfolded from there. Logan had a framed copy of one of the governance concerns headlines in his workshop at home. He'd put it there because Chloe had found the article and asked what governance meant, and Logan had explained it, and Chloe had said, "But you didn't do anything wrong," with the direct certainty of an 8-year-old for whom the answer was obvious, and Logan had thought that was the most accurate commentary on the entire situation and had kept the article to remember the perspective. Serena had discovered it one Saturday in June, standing in the doorway of his workshop while he was finishing something at the bench, and she'd looked at it and felt the specific complicated thing you felt about a chapter of your life that had been genuinely hard and was now far enough away to have edges. Why do you keep it? She asked. He glanced up from the bench. Chloe's review of it is written on the back. She turned the frame over. On the back, in pencil, in the careful handwriting of someone who was learning to write in the thorough, slightly oversized letters of a child committed to legibility. Dad didn't do anything wrong. Chloe Mercer. She stood there holding it for a moment. She insisted on her full name, Logan said, turning back to his work. For the record. Serena set it back on the shelf, facing out. She's going to be a problem for someone someday, she said. I know. I'm equal parts proud and concerned about it. He proposed in September. Not with a plan, not with a reservation at a restaurant or a coordinated moment or anything that required preparation she'd have noticed. It happened on a Sunday evening on his back porch, which had become one of her most familiar places over the past year. The yard going gold in the early fall light, the neighborhood doing its Sunday thing, Chloe inside doing homework with Ruth's intermittent supervision. They'd been talking about nothing in particular, the way you talked on Sunday evenings when the week hadn't started yet and there was still some space left. Something about the second Hendrix site. Something about a book Serena had been reading. Something about Chloe's new conviction that she wanted to study marine biology, which had evolved from an interest into what appeared to be a genuine vocational direction. Logan had been quiet for a moment, the comfortable kind of quiet, and then he'd said, I want to ask you something. She'd looked at him. His voice had a particular quality, not nervous exactly, more like someone who had decided something and was now doing the thing he'd decided without additional deliberation. He didn't get down on one knee, which she was glad about. It wasn't them, the staging of it. He just turned toward her and held her eyes and said, I want to do this properly. Marry me, if you want that. She looked at him for a second. Not in surprise, somewhere in the past months she'd understood they were moving in this direction, had turned the idea over in her private thoughts with the honest assessment she applied to important decisions, had concluded that what she felt was not the managed, theoretical approval of something that made sense, but the simple and overwhelming certainty of someone who had found a place they didn't want to leave. I want that, she said. He exhaled, not with relief, more like the release of something held with care that could now be set down. He took a ring from his shirt pocket, which was the only thing that was clearly premeditated, a ring that was not elaborate, a simple band with a single stone that she thought he'd probably spent a long time choosing to reflect exactly his understanding of her, not showy, not minimal, just exactly right. He put it on her finger and she looked at it in the fall light. I should tell you, she said, that I would have said yes regardless of the ring. I know, I wanted to get it right anyway. She looked at him. You got it right. He smiled, the real one, the full version, the one that had taken months to earn and that she thought about in the ordinary moments of ordinary days when it surfaced in her memory as proof that what she had was real. Inside, Ruth knocked on the porch door with the carefully timed intervention of a woman who had known for at least 20 minutes. She opened it and looked at them, looked at Serena's hand, and said nothing for a moment. Then she put her hand over her mouth and said, Finally. Mom, Logan said. I've been patient, Ruth said, with the serenity of someone who had been patient and was no longer required to be. Logan, she's been coming here for 10 months. I've been waiting. You haven't been waiting? You've been waiting. I've been waiting. She looked at Serena with clear, warm eyes. Welcome properly, she said. You were already, but now officially. Chloe came out 5 minutes later, summoned by some domestic signal that children received without adults understanding the frequency. She looked at the situation, her grandmother's expression, her father's expression, Serena's hand, the general quality of the air, and processed it with the focused intelligence of someone who had been watching for this and recognized it. She said, Are you going to live here? Serena looked at Logan, and Logan looked at Serena. We're going to figure that out, Logan said. Together. All of us. Chloe considered this for a moment. She looked at Serena. Her face held the particular complexity of an 8-year-old who had learned to want things carefully, who had spent her whole conscious life measuring how much to let herself count on what was good because she had early and permanent knowledge that good things could leave. Okay, she said, and then, after another moment, can we get a dog? Chloe, Logan started. The timing seems good, Chloe said. You're in a good mood. We're not getting a dog. I'll ask again later, Chloe told Serena, with the comfortable certainty of someone who understood the long game. Then she went back inside. Serena sat on the porch in the fall evening and laughed until her eyes were wet, which was not something she'd done in longer than she could calculate, and Logan sat beside her and laughed too. And Ruth went back inside, shaking her head with the satisfied expression of a woman whose family had just gotten larger. The year that followed was not simple. People with the habit of clarity needed to say that out loud occasionally because the tendency, once things went well, was to flatten the difficulty in retrospect, to remember the good parts and let the hard ones soften into background. The honest account required more than that. Serena and Logan moved into a house together in February of the following year, a house they chose together in a neighborhood that neither of them had lived in, which was a deliberate choice, neutral ground, a space that was theirs rather than either of theirs. Chloe moved her whole marine biology research collection into the second bedroom and within 2 weeks had covered one wall with a hand-drawn ocean map that Logan helped her scale to the actual proportions of the Pacific. The negotiation of a shared life between two people who had each become very practiced at managing alone was not seamless. Serena worked too much, which she knew and had always known, and which she managed better than she had before, but not perfectly. There were evenings Logan came home from the site to find her at the kitchen table with her laptop at 9 p.m., and his response to this had evolved from careful concern to a direct, non-apologetic, close the laptop. She did, most of the time. Not always. They were honest with each other about the not always, which was better than the alternative. Logan had his own version. He was not a man who asked for things easily, had spent 4 years after Maya's death running on self-sufficiency as a survival strategy, and self-sufficiency that deep left marks. There were weeks when something was wrong, and he didn't bring it to Serena until she'd noticed it and named it, and the naming required patience she gave him willingly, but that she also told him plainly she needed him to work on. He worked on it. Not perfectly. The same answer. Chloe, who had been watching both of them for a year by the time they all shared a house, observed the process with the thoughtful assessment she brought to most things and offered her verdict one evening at dinner. "You two are a lot of work for each other." "Chloe," Logan said, "I don't mean it bad. Maya's sister told me once that loving someone is just another word for trying hard on their behalf." She ate her food. "You both try hard, I can see it." She looked up at them. "It's good. I just wanted you to know I can see it." Serena looked at Logan across the table. He looked back at her with an expression she'd memorized by now, the particular one he had when something had happened that he wasn't sure how to hold, and so he just held it. And she thought about a year of Saturday dinners and courtroom testimony and structural reports and the northeast wall of a building that had burned and been repaired and the specific improbable path that had led from a gala in the rain to this kitchen table with this difficult, perceptive child who could see them trying. "We know you can see it," Serena said. "You've been seeing us from the beginning." Chloe seemed satisfied with this. "I'm still asking about the dog," she said. "I know," Logan said. "It's a when, not an if," Chloe told Serena confidently. "I'm aware of that," Serena said. The Hendricks project completed in March of that second year, 14 months after the contract signing, on schedule and under budget, which was not the result of everything going right. It was the result of enough things going wrong and being handled correctly that the cumulative effect was a finished project that stood up to scrutiny from every angle. The completion ceremony was small, a walkthrough with the Hendricks executive team, a handshake with Paul Hendricks, a modest gathering of the project leads afterward in the site's newly restored common space. Logan stood in the middle of the space looking at the finished ceiling, which was a specific piece of restoration work he'd overseen personally. A plaster ceiling in the main hall with original detail work that had required months of careful research, specialist consultation, and the kind of patient, focused execution that separated restoration from renovation. Paul Hendricks came to stand beside him. "You know what I've learned?" Paul said, looking at the ceiling, "from this whole mess of the last year and a half." "What's that?" "That sabotage leaves a specific kind of evidence, the absence of quality, things done just well enough to pass a check." He looked at the ceiling. "This is the opposite of that. This is someone who cared whether it was right when nobody was watching. Logan didn't say anything for a moment. That's the work, he said finally. That's just what the work is supposed to be. I know. Paul Hendricks looked at him with the consideration of a man who had spent a career watching other people work. It's rarer than it should be. Serena stood across the room talking to the Hendricks team leads, and she caught Logan's eye across the space and held it for a second, and the look between them was private and legible, and belonged only to them, the acknowledgement of everything that had brought them to a finished ceiling in a completed building on a Tuesday morning in March, both of them still standing, both of them more than they'd been when this had started. She looked away first, back to the conversation. He looked back at the ceiling. The work was good. Everything else was too, imperfectly and persistently and in the way that mattered. A year after the proposal, on a September evening with the city skyline catching the last long light of the day, Logan and Serena were married in a small ceremony. 30 people, a garden space that Logan had researched and Serena had approved, and Chloe had lobbied for on the grounds that it had a koi pond, which she considered a significant feature. It was not a perfect wedding. Ruth cried earlier than expected and couldn't stop, which made Logan's jaw set in the way it did when he was holding something, which made Serena take his hand before the officiant had even gotten through the opening. Chloe stood at Logan's side in the capacity she'd requested. Not flower girl, not junior bridesmaid, but what she'd called a witness, because she was 9 now and had opinions about ceremonial categories, and watched the proceedings with the focused, proprietary attention of someone who had been invested in this outcome for longer than either adult fully knew. When the rings were exchanged, Chloe nodded once to herself, with the private satisfaction of someone ticking off something important. The reception was a dinner, long and loud and disorganized in the way that dinners with real people were disorganized. Marcus Webb gave a toast that went 4 minutes longer than planned and was excellent. One of Serena's college friends spilled wine and handled it with admirable composure. Logan's crew from the Henderson Project showed up and were conspicuously the loudest table, and also the ones who danced first, which Serena noticed and loved without saying so. She said it later, in the car, heading to the hotel where they'd spend the night before the flight the next morning. Your crew danced first, she said. Phil dragged them out. Logan had his jacket off, his tie loose, looking exhausted in the good way. He said formal events required someone to break the seal. He's right. She leaned against his shoulder. I want to say something. Okay. I spent a long time building things and telling myself the building was enough. And it was. It was real. It was mine. I don't regret any of it. She looked out the window at the city going past, but I think what I was actually building toward, without understanding it, was the point where I'd have something to come home to. Not the company, not the apartment. She felt him listening, the quality of his attention that was complete and without agenda. I was building toward a kitchen that has too much flour in it, and a 9-year-old who has thoughts about everything, and you asking me if I'm okay like you actually want to know. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you're okay? I'm very okay. He put his arm around her and she settled into it, and the city moved past the windows in the dark, all its light and noise and indifferent life. And she was in it, and also, for the first time in a long time, genuinely separate from it, held apart by the specific gravity of a life that had other people at its center. That was what she'd learned. Not the lesson that life required balance, which everyone said and few actually practiced. Something more specific. That strength built in isolation had a ceiling. That the things most worth making couldn't be made alone. That the craftsman's instinct, to give the work what it actually needed, even when the easier version would have been fine, applied as much to a life as it did to a building. She'd built a company. She was proud of it with the clear, undefended pride of someone who had made something real from difficult materials. But she'd also, over a year that had cost her and changed her, built a family. Not the performed version, not the curated image that ended up on magazine covers, but the actual complicated breathing thing that required daily maintenance and the willingness to be seen in your less polished versions and the consistent, unglamorous choice to show up again the next day. Logan had taught her that, mostly by example and without ever intending to teach her anything. The man who went back through months of records at night because he saw something wrong. The man who showed up at a burning building because a voicemail sounded off. The man who told her what he was before asking her to choose it, because he didn't know how to offer less than the full true thing and had decided that was who he was. She had chosen it. She'd keep choosing it, not because it was uncomplicated, but because the complications were real and the thing underneath them was realer. Chloe got the dog in November, a rescue, 3 years old, with the impractical name she'd chosen after 2 weeks of deliberation, Captain. Not after anything specific. She'd simply decided he looked like a captain. He was medium-sized and energetic and destroyed 2 throw pillows in the first week, which Logan handled with the resigned acceptance of a man who had been overruled and knew it. He also slept at the foot of Chloe's bed every night and greeted Serena at the door with a consistency and warmth that she found, unexpectedly, one of the most reliable small pleasures of her daily life. One evening in December, she came home late from the office. A long day, a complicated client call, the ordinary attrition of running something large and real, and walked in to find the house loud with dinner preparations, Logan at the stove, Chloe at the table doing homework with Captain curled beside her chair, Ruth on the phone in the corner being opinionated about something. She stood in the doorway for a moment, coat still on, briefcase in hand, and let the noise of it wash over her. None of it was what she'd planned. Not the man at the stove, or the child at the table, or the dog, or the house, or the life that had assembled itself around a company gala and a viral video and a burning room and a series of Saturday dinners with bow-tie pasta. Chloe looked up and saw her. "You're late," she said without accusation. "I know, long day. Dad made the good soup. I can smell it from here." Logan turned from the stove. He looked at her in the doorway, still in her coat, and his expression was the open one, the real one. The one she'd been trying to describe to herself for over a year without finding the right words for it. It was the expression of someone who was glad she was there, specifically without complication or calculation. Just glad. "Go change," he said. "Dinner in 10. She went to change. She came back. She sat at the table and ate the good soup while Chloe explained her current theory about deep-sea communication systems, while Ruth offered her updated opinions about the city council, while Captain moved from chair to chair looking for something to be given, while Logan ate beside her in the comfortable proximity of people who had decided to share a life. Outside, December was doing its dark, cold thing. Inside, the lights were on. The single father who had learned to carry everything alone had found someone to carry things beside him. The billionaire who had built an empire with her hands and spent a decade inside the building had finally stepped outside. And between them, through the scandal and the fire and the courtroom and the flower-covered kitchen and the autumn porch and all the ordinary, unspectacular days that accumulated into a life, they had built something that no acquisition could value and no saboteur could reach, something that held. That was enough. That was, in the end, more than enough. It was everything.